The following podcast is proudly brought to you by Vite Ramen. Use the link in the description and use offer code BROKENSILICON to get 10% off tasty, healthy, and easy to make ramen. And also use the offer code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off Windows keys and die shrink to get 3% off everything else on the website at cdkeyoffer.com. Now on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I am joined by someone, actually, I think I had the link pulled up somewhere here last time we talked, that I haven't spoken with, at least audibly, for the last over 2 years. Over 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah, I don't even remember how we became acquainted. I'm sure we just noticed each other on Twitter or something, but, the reason you were on before, it was actually, as it turns out, one of the most popular Broken Silicon episodes. It was hey, look, can we be honest? Can we just sit down? Can we cut through the BS and the hype and just talk about what's even reasonable to expect from the next gen consoles? And there was so many buzzwords about SSDs back then, in both, not just the Sony, but the Microsoft camp as well, that I guess I'm not surprised why it was so popular, considering the word cloud of buzzwords that were swirling from fanboys at the time.
Yeah, at the time there was a lot of some people were saying the SSD would actually improve graphical performance, make the GPU faster, which was crazy. But there was a lot of people also saying an SSD, it makes your load times less. But it's actually a lot more than that. So I kind of wanted to, at that point, it was a lot about talking about what the benefits really were, because to some people it was a lot better than what they thought, and for some it was okay, no, it's not literally going to improve your GPU performance.
Well, I think there's of course, circumstances where it can to a certain degree, but it seemed like everyone thought that the PS5's I/O controllers and SSD setup would either do nothing but load times that were slightly faster, or it was going to double frame rates, and neither of those are true.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you had the Xbox Velocity architecture, which I was like, oh my God, if I keep seeing Velocity quoted on Twitter, I'm going to go insane.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting to see where Velocity's gone since then. They've kind of stopped talking about Velocity. Now it's mainly just direct storage API, but it's finally coming to PC, so now games might actually start using it. I think starting with Forspoken here in January now it's coming out. But
yes, I believe I heard that as well. You know what's interesting about the whole direct storage thing is not only how long that's taken to come out, but I remember that being a hyped up thing. Nvidia's version of it, RTX IO, at the Ampere reveal. And if we're being honest, I think if we're being honest, we have to say Nvidia kind of seems to have added that last minute to make it look like it had feature parity with the consoles, which isn't to say that they don't. It's just we haven't really seen RTX IO at all, basically.
So I think the reason that I actually recently looked into this, because I was like, where the hell is RTX IO? Why haven't we heard about it since? And it turns out that RTX IO is not a competitor or an alternative to direct storage. Mm-hmm. It's intended to work with direct storage. What RTX IO is, it's actually just the decompression hardware.
Mm-hmm.
So without direct storage, it's useless, because direct storage is a change in the IO pipeline that allows, basically, it allows the GPU to load data directly from the SSD. In a nutshell. Mm-hmm. But RTX IO is the decompression that can accelerate that.
Using tensor cores, right? I'm assuming, right? Just about everything.
I don't think it might be tensor core based. I know it's hardware based. I don't know what hardware it's using. But it's sort of like how BC Pack, for example, on the Xbox Series X and S is a decompression, and same with the PS5 has that Kraken decompression. It's just RTX IO is Nvidia's decompression, and AMD Radeon has an equivalent as well.
But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Before I get into the first discussion subjects, I'm who are you? Tell people where they can find you. Like, who is Meyer Tech Rants?
So I am one of those armchair CEOs on the internet.
There's a lot of
um,
those.
yeah, no, I'm just a guy on Twitter. I have a degree in computer science. I've done some small scale like indie game development projects like in university, nothing big. I know I've worked with a few game engines. I've had classes and stuff in business, so I'm reasonably well educated, but I'm not like a big scale game developer or anything like that. I'm just like a guy on the internet that kind of knows what he's talking about sometimes.
Well, yeah, but like the reason I started, or the reason I have guests on Broken Silicon in the first place, is just let's get someone in here every other week who is at least well versed in this more so. And I would say, even though you sell yourself short, you're much more well informed than the average commenter on
For sure,
WCCF
yeah.
Tech,
Yeah,
just to
maybe.
bounce ideas back and forth, because unless you bring in outside voices, you just get stuck in a bubble of your own thoughts and you don't really get any new opinions ever. And that's why I
Yeah.
really appreciate, like, I've caught an upcoming guest coming who's probably going to be, so like an anonymous Intel engineer, which should be interesting to get some real
Yeah, that's
perspective on
cool.
what it's like to work within Intel and like what he thinks of. And a lot of it I do want to talk about is like, what do you think about like just the fanboys, and like as someone who actually works on these chips, what do you
Yeah.
think about how people talk about Intel and AMD? And then I've got a couple of tech tubers and stuff, but I don't. There's not like a giant Intel release this week. There's not like a bunch of news this week per se. And so I kind of just wanted to have a more bird's eye view, casual discussion about everything. And that's why I've had you on. And I think the best place to start is I'm going to try doing this. I'm going to change the color here. Is with a reader mail from Gwen Farron. Gwen Farron says, on a scale of fine to 2-week old Taco Bell leftovers, how much do you think Nvidia is crapping their pants right now with the glut of GPUs on the market? With the recent news, or I guess the opposite of a glut, with the recent news of attempts to cancel orders and AIB's demanding delays, I can't imagine it's a fun time in the Nvidia boardroom right now. And that is where I want to start, is just kind of talking about the GPU crash. It's what I've been talking about in a lot of recent content, but really, you know, well, I guess let's start with what he said in the reader mail. Like, how do you think Nvidia is thinking right now about all of this?
I think Nvidia isn't nearly as worried as a lot of the AIBs and distributors are. I mean, a lot of the cards I think sitting around in warehouses are AIBs and distributors that, as far as Nvidia is concerned, they've already sold that stuff.
Mm.
Um, but I mean, they are Nvidia's partners, so Nvidia doesn't want to piss them off. Like they want to have a good working relationship. But on the same token, I feel like it's not Nvidia's fault that these guys um, over ordered and then overcharged to their consumers and then couldn't move their product and kind of put themselves in a position.
Well, that's an interesting point, right? Because this has been, I feel like more people than, of course, 2 years ago are finally getting this when I look around in discussions online. But like AMD and Nvidia don't really make extra money during these price hikes. It's the AIBs that do.
Yeah.
So Nvidia and AMD, they just want market share. I mean, and that's why when people are like, why
Hmm.
is AMD sell things from their website? It's like they make probably a higher percentage on the reference cards they're selling than
Yeah.
the AIB models. They don't care, they just want to get cards out there. It's the AIBs that, I mean, I can't say too much, but I've heard examples of like some distributors buying from AIBs and hearing some really interesting break even price points where like someone at one of the AIBs was trying to convince the distributor that if they sell, what was it? It was like a 7800 XT, a 6800 XT below $1,000, they're losing money. And I'm like, I just don't believe that AIB. I know they're
Yeah.
trying to convince you, and I'm sure they have. As someone who worked in sales in the automotive industry, there were times where we'd find ways to say we broke even at higher prices when we needed to, but I don't think so. It's the AIBs that kind of made this bed for themselves.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth in that to some extent. Like, it's not always the fault of the AIBs. Particularly with Nvidia, we knew early on, at least what I was hearing was it was pretty difficult. The Nvidia made it quite difficult for those AIBs to hit MSRPs.
Early on, they did, yeah, which
Yeah,
is why they had all the funny business, and that's what's so weird is when we talk about this, it can be confusing to a listener who's not like doing this as their job like me, because no, but
yeah,
early on, Nvidia was actually selling some of the founders cards, not the 3070. I think that always had a decent markup, but like the 3080s, were specifically the 3080 was not making much margin on a founder's card compared to what they would usually want to make.
yeah,
And then they were pushing it to the AIBs. And that's why you saw all those $800 cards at launch. But then shortages happened, RAM prices exploded, and prices did actually kind of need to go up for them to break even, but not to
yeah,
$1,200.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, so in terms of the situation right now, I mean, it's been almost 2 years, over a year and a half. The prices of a lot of things have gone down. I don't think it's unreasonable for the AIBs, unless Nvidia increased their prices on them, which I suppose is
I think they
possible.
have
But
slightly on some stuff,
yeah,
yeah.
um, but yeah, just claiming like they need to sell a 3080 for over $1,000, not a thing. I don't think.
No, and when you look at these products, like one of the examples I brought up in one of my recent videos, which was one of the AIBs had like warehouses of Turing cards. I don't want to say the exact numbers of each model, but it's like, guys, 2060 and lower, you know, hundreds of thousands of cards. It's like they're
Yeah,
the ones who ordered those and then expected to sell, for example, like a 1650 for $300. I don't know that I have much sympathy for that type of stuff. I mean,
yeah,
come on.
yeah. Nvidia's sold their products. They're going to move on with or without you. They might delay a little bit just to keep their partners happy, but they're ready to go pretty soon, I think. So,
Let me get into this then. An aspect I want to touch on this like GPU oversupply is, I don't know. I feel like just a few months ago there were still so many people in video after video I did saying things like, "Oh, prices are never coming back down again. Didn't you see the latest report that we're going to have shortages in GPUs till 2024?" And then and there's a lot of people that seem surprised by what happened just now. And I'm, maybe it's crashed slightly faster than I've expected, but really we've had a pricing decline for the past 3 months. It has been a pretty steady decline, and it's really only in the past 2 weeks that it's felt sudden at all. Um, I, does it surprise you that people were surprised this happened? Because there were so many people saying it's ruined forever. And I just think back to what about 2018? What about 2013? And even before mining, what about the GPU pricing crash in like 2008? I think people should go look up how cheap the flagships got with like the GTX 200 and HD 4000 series. I don't think it's entirely
yeah.
explained by competition. There were flagships selling for $200 a year after they came out for 600 back then. Like this has happened before, even without mining.
Yeah. No, it was always going to be the case that GPUs were going to come down in price. However, I might have a perspective that
Hmm.
some people might not like too much,
Well, to
and I
you,
can.
not me. So please make it. So you're the bad guy this episode.
So, remember the price hike with Turing when the 2080 Ti, let's start with the 1080 Ti, launched in 2017 at 699.
Hmm.
Incredible value. Early 2018, the there was a big crypto boom and the prices of GPUs went insane. By the end of 2018, that had ended and there was a big crash, and a lot of used 10 series came out on the market. Um, and then Nvidia launched Nvidia launched Turing at that point. And what did they charge for the 2080 Ti? $1,200. Where did they
Mm,
get that $1,200 mark? Well, everyone was saying at that point the GPU market had crashed. There was a flood of cheap Pascal GPUs on the used market, and Nvidia still charged $1,200 for a 2080 Ti, and a bunch of people bought it.
hmm.
That $1,200 was what the 1080 Ti was selling during the peak of the 2018 crypto boom.
Yeah, that's true. And that's let me just skip ahead to Kinnahoon25, who writes in and says, "Hey, Tom and Myers, with the plummeting GPU prices, do you see this causing Nvidia and AMD to reconsider charging too much for their high-end cards? Usually this would be an easy answer, but the rising cost of food and energy and more people being hesitant over spending a grand on just a graphics card lately, it seems, especially when you apparently just got a 3090 for $800. By the fall, 3090s may go for 600 or less. We'll see. Nvidia and AMD aren't just competing with themselves; they're competing against a cheap used market and them and their previous gen and each other. So that's kind of what you're hinting at. Do you think? How do you see the pricing panning out for next gen? Because I do want to jump in and say I do think some people are being a little too trigger happy with this idea that it's going to be a cheap generation.
Yeah,
They're being or too optimistic, At the
yeah,
same time, I do think that they can't go as buck wild as they probably wanted to deep down.
maybe. There are definitely a lot of factors. I mean, a big one that is probably a lot of people are thinking about and a lot of people are feeling right now is the recession that we're headed into.
Hmm.
We don't know yet how that's going to happen, how much money people are going to have. But it's also, Nvidia wants to make as much money as they can. Nvidia's been watching the market, seeing what gamers, they know a lot more than we do, how many gamers bought the cards during the height of crypto and for what prices. There was definitely a lot of miners that were buying the cards for a lot of money, but they know how many gamers were buying it.
They
And
do,
if,
even though if they don't want to, even if they overinflate the number, even if they
yeah, yeah,
pretend they were all gamers, they know someone has a spreadsheet where they know the difference. Who was a miner, who was a
for
gamer.
sure. So if they saw that a lot of a lot of gamers were spending well over $2,000 on 3090s, they're going to want to capitalize on that. That not capitalizing, that's money left on the table, right? They're going to do what's best for Nvidia's going to do what's best for Nvidia.
Hmm.
That being said, based on the various factors, for example, there's obviously the prices of Ampere GPUs are going down. And I don't think that's necessarily going to stop, even if the next generation is quite expensive, largely because they are so much faster, right? We're
Exactly.
looking,
Just to kind of I want to put in some specifics to what you're saying here, because I broke this down and I'm probably going to use this in a video in the next few weeks, like just how it's actually more of the perspective of the used seller on eBay. Like, depending on how Lovelace is priced, what does it make sense to sell a used Ampere car for? And therefore, what makes sense for a buyer to consider?
mhm,
Like, even if we're saying Nvidia doesn't go completely ham, let's say the 4090 is double the performance of a 3090 and it's 2 grand. And let's say the 4080 Ti is a cut down 4090 and it's, so it's way stronger than a 3090 still for 1200. Let's say they do use a more mid-range die for the 4080, but it's still stronger than a 3090 for like 800. Then you get to 600, you're probably close to 3090 performance, which makes sense. I mean, if we're being honest, the 3070 was as strong as the 2080 Ti. This is a history of Nvidia making their 70 class be as strong as the flagship. Did the same with Pascal versus Titan Maxwell. They've done this many times. Well, then that means, I mean, I think the most they charge for a 4070 is probably $600. If they charge $600 and it's as strong as a 3090 while using less energy, even if it uses 300 watts, that's still less. that's where we get to, yeah, I can see a 3090 being $600 or
Yeah,
less.
yeah,
I can see a 3080 Ti being 500, a 3080 being 400. Even if the 4060 is like a 200 watt 3070 Ti for $400, well, that means 3070 Ti's will be on the market probably for 350 or $300. And so you can see the top end isn't going to be an issue, right? Like you're kind of saying, right? The 4090 will sell at 2000. It's not competing with the
yeah,
previous gen. But
yeah.
mid range and lower, it's kind of a nightmare to price Lovelace. It's a nightmare to try to sell a last gen card.
Right. And yeah, so Nvidia's competing with the used market only in the mid range. And that's also, we're probably going to wait a little bit, before they release those
Hmm.
mid range cards, just because they want that market to die down a little bit. Um, there, there's also a chance, we've been talking about maybe the performance of ray tracing
Mm.
per rasterization to increase quite a bit. Say if there's uh, a Lovelace card that has the same rasterization performance as equivalent Ampere card, maybe it's twice as fast in ray trace or something. We have I don't really know.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, we
been
have to
some
be
rumors.
careful because
Yeah.
the Ampere rumors that I covered, there was like, yeah, I think I had a benchmark where Minecraft was like 3 times better than Turing, but then they updated
Mm,
Turing and it caught up to it, and Minecraft was
yeah.
definitely not the norm in ray tracing
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think I will say this, I would be surprised, and it sounds like I'm lowballing, but I would be surprised if Lovelace wasn't at least 20% better at ray tracing per the same raster increase. Meaning, like, if you double, it's now 2.4 times ray tracing or something.
Sure. Yeah, the double number. I really have no idea. It's just, but if it is
That's still a
a
big difference, though.
note, if it is a notable increase, as more games get more ray tracing, we're going to see, these newer cards perform disproportionately well.
Hmm. Yeah, as things age, you can see Lovelace aging better, than Ampere does in like a lot of the newer games. So if you're gonna spend $400, on a 4060, well, maybe you would over a $300 3070 Ti because it uses less energy, has better ray tracing. But I know, I 100% agree that one thing that's definitely changed, I would suspect, in NVIDIA's Lovelace launch strategy is I don't think we're seeing their mid range cards for a very long time, that they're going to just let those used cards sit there for a while. But actually, this kind of also brings me to another question because we're also getting to where we talk about if people are even interested. And I'm not actually sure what I think about this. Obviously, I think there's a lot of people that are interested. Obviously, I think that if Nvidia launches something at least twice as strong as the 3090 for 2 grand, the people who bought 39ers are going to buy that. It's going to
Yeah.
happen. I'm not doubting that at all. But I do wonder how many people in the mid range, even if Lovelace is significantly better, just don't really care. And this is a question I thought of right before we started recording. Um, how much do you think the goodness, if I put that in quotes, of a generation dictates when people upgrade versus just timing? Like, how much of it is, oh, this generation's twice as good as the increases we usually get, and how much of it is this was a good time for people to upgrade, and even if the next gen is way better than what the last one brought, they upgraded last year, so they don't care.
So there's definitely going to be some of that. I think a lot of people who upgraded to Ampere, even if Lovelace is like as good as people are hoping it could be, there's definitely going to be a lot of people that just they had Ampere, they're good to go for a bit. But to some extent, the bigger of a difference there is generation on generation, the more of those people that just upgraded are going to feel that pull, right? So, I'm still on Pascal. I have a 1080 Ti. I don't have a ray
Hmm.
tracing capable GPU. Um, and I might have upgraded during this past generation, but shit hit the fan so then I was just watching prices going, yeah, no, I can probably just wait till the next generation and see what happens then. And I think a lot of people upgraded. But I think there's a lot of people like me too that just kind of look for the value and wait for prices because they've got a certain idea of what they want to spend on a GPU, and they don't want to spend $1,000 on a GPU and get a 70 tier, right? Because that just
Well,
but
let me put this in perspective too. It's like, all right, so Ampere was like, let's say 50% better than Turing, but
mm,
it wasn't actually that much more efficient. Okay. Well, then let's also think about this though. Turing was more expensive than an insane price increase over Pascal that a lot of people skipped. And so even if Ampere was a 50% increase and Lovelace ends up being, let's say, around a doubling of performance,
mm.
I wonder how much people will still go think of Ampere. It still to me doesn't feel like the hype around Lovelace is as big as Ampere. Do you agree? Like the hype around Ampere in 2020 was absurd, and RDNA too. And I'm not even sure how I would measure this really, but I just feel like people aren't as blown away by RDNA 3 and Lovelace rumors simply because even if RDNA 3 and Lovelace are a bigger deal relatively speaking, than RDNA 2 and Ampere. RDNA 2 and Ampere were a big increase after years of stagnation.
Yeah. I do agree with that. I think the years of stagnation, and we say years of stagnation, but Pascal was actually pretty good over Maxwell, and Maxwell was pretty good over what was before that. Not
Kepler.
Kepler, yeah.
Kepler was much more stagnation, and Maxwell was actually only like 30% better, but it
Yeah.
was so much more efficient. It was impressive in its own
Yeah.
right.
Really, it was Turing that everyone was just
Hmm.
disappointed as hell in. Like, ray tracing is exciting, and DLSS became good. It didn't start off that way, but it became very
It
good.
really wasn't good until Ampere came out, for being
Yeah,
honest. That's
basically.
what's so funny.
But so everyone was just disappointed as hell in Turing. Turing didn't sell well. Like, the 2080 was the same price and the same performance as the 1080 as the 1080 Ti. People were like, "What the hell is
And
this
it had
garbage?"
less RAM,
And it had less RAM. It was like, "What the hell?" So, just the disappointment in Turing really ramped up a lot of the hype for Ampere because people were like, "Well, this is what we wanted out of Turing." So there's a lot of hype there. And now it's kind of the hype for Lovelace is lower just because they're kind of burnt out on GPUs. Like the
That's what
prices
I'm
have
feeling
just
too.
been
That's what
so
I feel like.
high. They're just they probably all just spent so much money on, not all, but a lot of people spent a ton of money, way overspent on Ampere GPUs, and they don't even want to think about it, right?
Hmm. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I truly think. I think that even if this is it should be a more exciting generation than before. The thing is, the previous generation came after a really disappointing generation. It's kind of like if you're like at like an open mic night or at karaoke, and it's like, well, I'm not as good of a singer as the guy coming on after me, but the person who went before me sucked so much, I look great. And I feel like that's
Yeah.
how people think of Ampere. And people are
Yeah.
so many people, you say you had Pascal and you skipped Ampere. I think a lot of people skipped Turing and then they
Yeah.
all bought Ampere. So that's just kind of what I'm wondering is despite Lovelace and RDNA 3 being another mega upgrade, arguably a bigger deal than the previous generation, so many people upgraded last gen after being disappointed with the previous one that I wonder if that really is going to be just an anchor, a weight on the neck of trying to get people to buy Lovelace because it is going to be impressive. But I just wonder how many people are like, I'm so stressed out from the previous gen. I'm just going to stick with my 3070.
I mean, didn't Jensen literally say during the keynote something to the effect of Pascal friends, this is your time to upgrade?
Yeah, that was a huge marketing push. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, a lot of people skipped it, and now it's a combination of and not only did they just buy, but they just, in a lot of cases, massively overpaid, and they just don't want to think about an upgrade anymore for a while.
That's and so. All right, let me just to kind of put a pin in this part of the conversation then. And I'll give some context too. What I have to be careful how I say it. Let's just say that the way 8102 is designed, the flagship is designed. If it's even remotely close to the margins they wanted on like a 3090, it's going to be an over $2,000 card. So would you agree though that the flagship is still probably going to be 2 grand to 2,500 for like a 4090 or 4090 Ti at launch?
Yeah, I think around $2,000 is what I'm expecting.
I never bought into the rumors, which I think most of the time was just speculation from people that it's going to be 3 grand. I don't think Nvidia has ever really, but I do think they wanted 2,500.
So to me, it depends on whether or not they're launching the 4090 Ti. So we've kind of been saying 4090 or 4090 Ti,
Hmm.
but I think that is an important distinction. If they're launching like at the beginning of the generation a 4090 and a 4090 Ti together, there's going to be a significant price difference between them.
Hmm.
And the 4090 is probably going to be, I could, if they're doing them both at the same time, I could see the 4090 being uh, $1,600 and the
Hmm.
4090 Ti being $1,000 more.
Like maybe 2,400 and 1,700 or something like that.
Something like that. But because I've been saying for a while, like, I just don't see how NVIDIA could launch both 4090 and 4090 Ti together. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard,
like,
right? Because we have that engineering sample, and I'll have to put it in
right.
engineering sample that said 4090 Ti, but I think people need to remember that testing is, well, it's not cheap, but it's not like the final decision. Like they could have had someone laser etch in 4090 Ti on an engineering sample, or it could be fake, by the way.
Could be,
And
yeah.
and then they just go, we're not launching it. That's and I will say this too, just again to give context, for 100%, guys, Nvidia briefed partners on a 600-watt 4090 Ti 2 months ago. They briefed them on it, so that was definitely their plan as of 2 months ago. But I have to be honest here, and I think this is something I've seen you say on Twitter. I feel like they're just going to do the 4090 first, and then later do a 4090 Ti. I
Right.
feel like they're going to change their mind.
Because there's a big advantage to doing them separately. If they first sell the 4090, all of the
Hmm.
enthusiasts are going to buy it. And then 8, 10 months, 12 months later, they can release the 4090 Ti. And a bunch of people that bought the 4090 are going to go out and upgrade to the 4090 Ti because there's a bunch of people that have to have the best. Doesn't
Hmm.
matter what it is, but they have to have the best. And those people will argue that, like, Titans, for example, don't count. They won't buy the Titans because, oh, that's a prosumer card. That's not a consumer gaming card. That's how they justify not spending $2,500, $3,000 on a GPU.
And I always
Um,
remind them that they're little bitches for not having the best card.
right?
Because
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you don't get to spend $1,500 and then say, well, that's not for gamers. Well, my response always is, it gets higher frame rate, so you don't have the best card and you still spent 1,500. But I digress. Go
Right.
on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But they want to, like, the 3090. Like, let's be honest, it's over double MSRP, and for most of the time during the boom, it was selling for well over $1,000 more than the
To the
3080.
point that I was telling people maybe just get an A5000 or A6000 to
Right?
have the best. Like, because I mean, once you get over 3 grand, I'm like, dude, just get the 48 GB card for bragging rights at this point.
Yeah, like, it was ridiculous. And the performance improvement of the 3090 compared to the 3080 was 10% on average,
Yeah.
between 5 and 15%.
In 8K, it's more than 10%. Big deal. Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, okay, show me your 8K gaming monitor that you're playing on. No, it's
Hmm.
stupid. Like, the 3090 never really made sense unless you had to have the best. I mean, it's not as bad now. You can get a 3080 or a 3090 for $800 on eBay, but
Yeah. It's quite a
but
turn.
But for most of this generation, it financially made freaking no sense at all and existed successfully only because so many people have to have the best. You know, there
Hmm.
is a card above the 3080, so they have to have it. And they can't argue that, oh, it's Titan, it doesn't count. It's not a gaming card. Well, no, this is Nvidia was genius for, as far as I can tell, discontinuing Titans and calling them 90s
Hmm.
because
Yeah,
now
because
people,
now it's not a prosumer card, and they just made it a little cheaper, and there you go. I
yeah,
would say this though too, like just as an update too, to just be clear about like what I'm saying from like behind the scenes information. Like to my knowledge, Nvidia hasn't briefed partners on anything new than what they did 2 months ago. So the current plan, I don't know, the right word's not legally, but like semi-officially, is we're going for a 600-watt flagship. But I've also heard that some AIBs, surprise, have had power problems with the 600-watt boards. And so,
surprise.
yeah, I feel like there is a good chance they just make it a 450-watt, $1,500 to $2,000 card at launch, and then let the dust settle. And then they launch the flagship once they figured out the power problems, number one. And let's be honest, after they know what they actually need to do to make sure they beat RDNA 3. Because if they wait longer, they can kind of wait for better RAM to come out. Like I was told that it might actually be
Yeah,
capable of using
actually,
GDR7, by the way. And to the people that doubt that they would launch a GDR6X card this year and then use the same board to launch a GDR7 or an updated version of the same design to use GDR7, the 4090 Ti uses a 16 pin that didn't even exist when the 3090 came out. So just remember that they've done this before where they update the board with newer standards. Yeah, and
yeah,
actually, yeah, with GDR7 on the horizon, it even makes more sense for them to not launch the 4090 Ti yet.
yeah. Originally, I was basically saying, you know, from a business standpoint, it made no sense for them to launch them together, because yeah, like you say, there's definitely a lot of benefits. You know, not only can they get that second sale, but they can also add in new technologies, give the board partners more time to refine the designs.
Hmm.
There's a lot of benefits to waiting for that 4090 Ti instead of pushing it out. That being said, if they do push it out and
Hmm.
it costs nearly $1,000 more, that's still a viable strategy from Nvidia's perspective because it's them like basically accepting that they're not going to get that second sale later on, but
True.
what they're getting instead is way higher margins on that insanely overpriced card
Yeah,
that
they're boosting
people
performance by
basically have.
10% early, right? Just so
Yeah,
they can get the money now.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
well, I was just gonna not to cut you off. I was just gonna add. I think this scenario, launching the 4090 Ti first, makes sense if they're planning to do a full refresh 1 year later. That's less of a major upgrade, like more of a Kepler 2.0 thing, where they go, "Hey, this new one, it's not doubling. It's not even 50% better. It's like a 20 to 30% better generation. We're using better yields, better binning." And we have GDR7 across the lineup. That is an option for what they could do. That for me would be why they launched the 4090 Ti right away. It's because they want to beat AMD to market. They know they're probably not going to win, so they should just make it as expensive and big and early as they can. And then they're going to do a refresh for the whole new generation next year. But if they're not going to do
it
that, I think
could.
it makes no sense. I think it just, you got to do a 4090 then to just leave room for a new flagship if you need it.
Yeah, and I mean with Turing, we saw the. I think the reason they created the super line was because they burned the TI naming on by
Yeah.
launching the 2080 and the 2080 Ti at the same time. So
Yeah. It just feels dumb to launch a 4090 and a 4090 Ti because at that point
yeah,
you go, well, then this is the new 80 class. Like you have,
yeah,
like, what's
yeah,
going on,
exactly.
NVIDIA?
Yeah,
Let me ask this then. I think we agree that no matter what, like they're going to be at least 1,500, at most 2,500 for this flagship. Where do you see? And I think you've seen kind of the leaked die configs, right? Like top Lovelace is 80,102. It's like
yeah,
1,800. 18,000, not 1,800, 18,000 CUDA cores. You're looking at something that doubles performance. And then 8103 is actually significantly smaller. 8103 is really similar in the size difference to what we saw with 104 to 102 previous gen. And that's probably
Yes.
going to be something a little better than a 3090. And then you have 104 that's like a little worse than a 3090. And then 106 that's probably around 3070 Ti or something. Like, where do you see the 4080 being segmented and priced? Because I've actually been thinking about this a lot the past few days, and I could actually see an argument for why the 4080 may be farther away from the 4090 this time around than last gen.
Yeah. No, I actually definitely think that's the case. I mean, if you just look at the core counts, it looks like 8102 is way bigger than 8103.
Hmm.
But if you look at previous generations, that's actually proportionally what we've seen in the past. And in the past, it's been about around a 30% difference.
Hmm.
And if they are increasing I mean, if they want to charge $2,000 for the 4090, I think it makes a lot of sense to put the 4090 is at first, the
Hmm.
only 8102 GPU, release the 4080 on 8103 at about 30% slower for maybe $1,000, and have so the 4090 will be, I say, could be more expensive than the 3090 was, but offer more of a performance benefit, more
Hmm.
carrot, I guess, more reason to
Yes.
get the 4090 over the 3080. Because yeah, we just talked about how a ton of people still bought the 3090 over the 3080 because they wanted to have the best. But also a lot of people went 10%, I'll just save my money.
Hmm.
Um,
The 3090's success is largely a result of the fact that people are just buying whatever they could get their hands on.
yeah, maybe. Um, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous, but
There were a lot of people I know who said, I can't get a hold of a 3080, and any of the ones that ever come in stock are $1,200 anyways. I'm just getting a 3090.
yeah. I mean,
And I don't think that will be the case this time around. So I think Nvidia's got to be
yeah,
smarter about it.
I think the cards probably will sell around MSRP. We can talk about that more a little bit later if you want.
This summer, whether you're getting exercise outside or finding ways to stay active indoors like me, it's always nice to have something around that acts as a quick and tasty meal that's also healthy, full of protein, and reasonably priced. For me, that's Vite Ramen, who is a sponsor of this piece of content. Vite Ramen is an American company that pays its workers fair wages and crafts a protein and nutrient-dense meal that takes minutes to make without sacrificing taste. In fact, it's even quicker now with Ramen Go, a product that offers the same calories and taste as their traditional V3 packages you're probably used to now if you're a follower of this channel, while allowing you to even more quickly make your food or bring it to work for lunch. And they keep updating their recipes, like the new V3 edition of beef pho, so you keep having fun new flavors to try. Click the link in the description and use the offer code BROKENSILICON to save 10% off a variety of different special bundles just for Moore's Law Set fans that include things like spoons, chopsticks, and more if you so choose. This is a great deal for you, and it helps support this channel tremendously. Seriously, I eat it. It's tasty, it's healthy, it's fast. They keep making even better and better recipes that are quicker and quicker to make, and it's reasonably priced. Try Vite Ramen today. Well, Roy Ackerman writes in and he says, Hi, Tom and Meyer. In light of the crypto market and plummeting GPU prices, do you expect the next gen will end up with closer to MSRP prices and better availability at launch? I currently have a 1080, which I grabbed for $650 during its release month. So that would have been 5 years ago. Oh, wait, 6 years ago. I was hoping to grab and upgrade this gen. Cheers, Roy.
I absolutely think. I mean, I think there's going to be a certain number of people that will buy Lovelace basically right away. There's going to be a big rush in the first, few weeks, month, maybe 2 months, where availability could be spotty.
Yeah,
Um,
I do want to jump in though and say this preemptively to undoubtedly the people in the comments who week one of Lovelace sales will be like, "Oh, it's just like before." Guys,
yeah,
same thing happened with Turing, Pascal, Polaris, GCN.
Every
Every
generation.
generation sells out the first month. This is not comparable to what happened with Ampere. Sorry, I just get annoyed when
Exactly. Yeah, yeah,
people
yeah.
like go on, go on.
Yeah, so the first, yeah, we're going to see people, oh, it's the same. No, it's not. So yeah, there could be a short period of time where you can't buy for MSRP, but just like hold on to your britches for a month, and I think you'll be fine. So the question is, what is MSRP going to be? Like, you'll
Mhm.
be able to buy it at MSRP, but you might not like what MSRP is.
Well, and
Um,
so let me say this too. Like, I think in a world where there would be massive shortages, hard to get products, that's the world where Nvidia would charge $2,500 for a 600-watt flagship out of the gate. And then they
yeah,
also launch a cut down 8102 for like 1200 for like 1,000 because they can. But in a world where there aren't as many shortages and AMD's super competitive and there's going to be availability, that's where I could actually see Nvidia going, oh, actually, like you're saying, the 4080 should be based on 8103, but we'll use full 8103. It'll be like 30% weaker. But because it uses a die that's frankly two-thirds as big, we can afford to price it at $800 if we need to. Even though 4 nanometers is expensive, it won't cost much more to make than a 3080. Although I will say it's probably going to use more energy than a 3080, so it's going to cost more to make because of the board costs. But that's why I think they would use a different die for the 4080 as well.
I think they're going to want to charge $1,000 for the 4080. I think they could charge as low as 800, depending on
Hmm.
what they think they can get away with, because they have more data on that than we do, because they were
Exactly. Yeah, they
seeing
do.
what gamers bought throughout this whole past thing. Um, but yeah, I think best case scenario, we're looking at an 8103 4080 for $800. And to be clear, 8103, again, it looks a lot smaller than 8102, but I think it's only going to be about, 30% slower, and it's going to be a massive upgrade over even the 3090 Ti. Like,
Hmm.
that's kind of where I'm looking to upgrade personally, to be honest, is either 8103 or Navi 32, depending
Hmm.
on
It's
what
kind
we
of
end
what
up
I'm thinking a
getting.
little bit as
Yeah.
well, depending on what happens with if now that I have a 3090, like if I even care
Yeah.
too much. But
Yeah.
because that's the interesting question though. If the 4080 comes out, let's say it's, I don't know, 40% better than a 3090, but it has less RAM and costs more money than what I bought already, I'll go, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Where do you think the 4070 would be priced at then? Because my suspicion is $600 3090 performance.
Honestly, that's my expectation is too. I've seen some people on Twitter say, "Oh, it's going to be 499, maybe 549," and I'm like, 499 is not happening.
I could see 549 maybe.
549 maybe. I think $600 is more likely. Like, we are going to see an increase, but it's not going to be a huge increase, right? Nvidia's, like, we also have to consider, like, inflation exists.
Mhm.
There's multiple factors: inflation, the fact that what can they get out of gamers, and they can always charge a little bit more now and then reduce prices, sort of do what AMD's done in the past with like Ryzen 5000, right? The price starts off high, and then as sales start to decline, we'll let those prices start slipping.
Mhm.
um
Maybe not officially, but they let the prices
yeah,
on
not
Newegg and
officially.
Amazon go down.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, and I think when we look at the high power consumption of Lovelace, which again, I think at a minimum we're looking at a 450-watt 4090 and probably a 350-watt 4080, although it could certainly be 400 watts. Um, I Yeah, a reason they're doing this though too is to maximize the performance they get out of a given die space. This is them deciding, if we just take a smaller die and clock it 50% faster, it has half the efficiency, but we're also getting something 20% better in the same amount of wafers. So I think that it makes a lot of sense to just start the 4070, push it really hard to like 300 watts, and say better than a 3090, $600. That way it's not really it's barely competing with the used cards on the market. And I think that's just where they let the lineup sit until the used market starts. I don't know
Yeah.
if it ever will, though. We'll see where it goes. Like, they may be really reluctant to ever launch a 4060 outside a laptop. I bet they launch the 4060 to laptop beginning of next year,
Probably.
But I mean, okay, so let me ask then, what do you think the power consumption they will land on with the 4080 is? 'Cause I know so many people think it's decided. It's really not. It's not decided. And when I look at the fact that I think they can, because I did an analysis video on, I think they can get away with 500 watts in a 3-slot design if they want to. Can they get away with 400 watts in a 2-slot design? Because I had a 3080 Ti I tested, and I overclocked it to use 400 watts, and it worked. It was a little loud, but if they could make 450 watts already fit inside a 3090 cooler with a better heat sink, and just they did tweaks all over it to make it cool better. Do you think they could do the same with like a 3080 Ti cooler and push it to 400 watts? Because I don't. I know there's rumors it'll be above that, but I'm sorry, for a 4080, if it's especially if it's 8103, I just don't know why you would try to go over 400 watts when below 400 means anyone who owned a 3080 can probably power it in their power supply.
The thing is, could they? Yeah, they could. Um, with enough engineering and tweaking, they could probably get it not be crazy loud. But like the question is the engineering cost worth it?
Hmm.
Um, it's hard to say. Like, yeah, could they? It's possible, but and you also have to consider these cards like the 3090 Ti. All of that engineering effort and the tweaking and stuff that was reflected in the price of the card. Whereas a 3080 isn't this crazy Halo, or the 4080 won't be this crazy Halo product. It's a more reasonably priced, relatively
Relatively
speaking,
speaking.
card. So they're probably want to have something that's a little bit easier to mass produce, a little bit easier for AIBs to get functional design with, because it's not just Nvidia's engineering getting a card and board working that cools it properly. It's the AIBs that also need to be able to accomplish MSRP, or at least close to
Hmm.
MSRP, with some margins without overspending on engineering to make it work. So like could they? They could, but it's not a good idea.
You think it's more likely, in other words, it sounds like you're arguing they're likely to just cap it at like 350 watts or something so that it's
350
doable.
watt cap is way more likely in my opinion.
Hmm.
400 is possible, but that's pushing, like unless they're willing to increase the size of the card. Like if the
Which maybe,
4080,
I don't know.
yeah, maybe it'll be halfway in between what the 3080 and 3090 reference design sizes were. We don't know where this is going, but 400 watts in a 2-slot design, that's it's possible, but pushing it, it's just the cost is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. I remember how much, even though I had consistent, all sources actually, a few months ago saying the flagship seems to be around 500 to 600 watts, 450 watts minimum, I held out going, but 450 watts just seems like anything above that's absolutely absurd. And now we're kind of
Yeah,
hearing they may back it back down. That's kind of where I'm leaning with the 4080 as well, because I don't know where these rumors are coming from of like a 420 watt 4080 and a 450 watt 4090, because relatively speaking, the 3090 used 10% more energy than the 3080. So that's not 10%. That's almost the same energy. So if you're
yeah,
going to have a 450 watt 4090, I think 400 watt max 4080. I just,
yeah,
if they're
yeah.
choosing to use 8103, that to me signals they're choosing to bump it down a little bit so they can mass produce something reasonable below a grand. That's what I think it indicates.
Yeah.
I actually want to what was the phrase? Switch gears here for a second to the AMD side of this equation. So the Remedy writes in and he says, "Hello, Tom and guest. We all know about Nvidia trying to reduce 5 nanometer orders and delaying their Lovelace launch, and that competing against their own Ampere stock is probably something they want to avoid. But AMD is also going to have to deal with this secondhand Ampere stock saturating the market as well. What do you think this could mean for RDNA 3 pricing? Will this affect it at all compared to NVIDIA, potentially driving down the cost for the new cards? Or will the next generation pricing be astronomical compared to even the COVID madness?" No, I mean, anything affecting NVIDIA is affecting AMD, but like, how do you think it might be different for them? Or do you think it's different at all?
I don't think it's different at all. In the past, AMD has had different strategies trying to undercut NVIDIA, and it never worked for them.
Hmm.
Like in AMD, there's a small part of the market that'll go for AMD because they're better value or whatever. But for the most part, AMD and GPU or like, GPU sales are dominated by mindshare. Basically, playing the budget option um, only works when that's the only option that you have.
Hmm.
If you have something that can actually compete, playing off as the budget option means you get screwed because people high prices basically have this air of quality. People think that if you're lower in price, it's crap. And people have been treating AMD like that until Radeon until Ryzen started changing that, and
Hmm.
you know
And it seems to have mostly only affected their CPU mindshare to this day. It's just mind blowing. I've
yeah.
said this a million times, but an anecdote that I saw in person at the Carolina Games Summit when I was at that conference in August was something that a couple of contacts there pointed out to me. Like, if you have a 3070 Ti MSRP of $600, people will pay $900 and line up around the block to get it during shortages. But the AMD cards, they really couldn't get people to pay $1,000 for a 6800 XT easily. I know that appeared on Newegg to everyone listening, but very few people actually paid that much. People are willing to go a little over MSRP for AMD, but not a lot over. And in Nvidia, they are.
Yeah, AMD's in a tough spot because if they price too low, they get looked at like they're the budget crappy brand, and they're undesirable. So there must be a reason they're so cheap, right? But if they price too high, people just aren't willing to pay that.
Hmm.
Um, so they kind of that's why we've seen more recently, except for at the Halo tier, the 6900 XT was two-thirds the price of the 3090, but the 6800 XT was only $50 below the 3080. Like in Nvidia has been launching first, and AMD has been launching afterwards, looking at the pricing and basically going just a little bit under, except
Hmm.
for at the Halo tiers, right? Where the AMD simply can't charge as much at the Halo tiers, but everywhere else, in anywhere where people are thinking about value, AMD is basically just copying Nvidia's homework, and
So,
they kind
so
of have to.
well, let me ask then. So, how do you think it's going to pan out? Because I do think it sounds like what you're saying is, look, of course, short, like, of course, just a pile of extra cards on the market's going to affect AMD. You don't think it'll affect them any differently than Nvidia, and that means you like Navi 33, let's say, is like, again, 6900 XT performance in 1080p or close, worse in 4K, only 8 gigs of RAM. I think they might have wanted to charge $500 for that in the past. I feel like now they're going to have to do $400 for that because it's an 8 gigabyte
Right.
card around Navi 21 performance. Don't you think though? And I don't think that's crazy. I mean, they're selling the 650 XT for $400 now. So why wouldn't they sell the 7600 XT for $400 if it doubles 6600 XT performance?
I'm just having such a hard time believing that Navi 33 is 6900 XT performance with only 8 gigs of RAM. That's insane to me.
Well, the
Um,
2080 is 1080 Ti performance with only 8 gigs of RAM. I mean, keep in mind what
yeah,
I'm
okay,
saying.
we like Yeah, it's possible, but just 8 gigs of RAM just seems so low for that. I'm not sure like how they get it'll have to be cheap to get people to buy it.
I think 400 at most, and if they go over that,
Yeah,
people are gonna be like, "Whatever, I'm just getting a used card or
ex-
something for 300 bucks."
exactly. Like eight gigabytes of RAM isn't what it used to be.
I've seen people say this too, like, "There's no way they should launch a card that powerful with 8 gigs of RAM," and my response always is, "It's always about price though, isn't it?" I mean, if it was
Yeah,
$300 for an 8 gigabyte 6900 XT, it'd be the second coming of Christ for PC gamers, wouldn't it? I
for
mean,
sure.
all
Yeah.
of a sudden it's 500 and it's evil. So, I think there's a medium there that they're just gonna try to hit. I think it used to be 450, and now it's probably 400, 350 to 400. Because it does cost less to make than the 6700 XT. Again, I keep being told
hmm
this.
For the right price, it also kind of depends on what the ray tracing performance and
Mhm.
FSR performance and stuff like that's going to look like. Is FSR 2.0 getting in more games? That could help out. Not that FSR 2.0 is a selling feature because it works in NVIDIA 2, but FSR 2.0 basically helps diminish the
Yeah.
value offered by DLSS. That's what it is. It's a market mitigation, is what it
Mhm.
is,
It's
which is
not to,
fine.
like, parity quite yet, but it definitely mitigates the issue in a big way.
It's a mitigator, yeah. Which is that's what they need. That's fine. But yeah, at the right price, 6900 XT with 8 gigs of RAM, like at the right price, that's a great. It could be a great option. It's just
So I just, gun up to your head, what's the right price? And this is just for fun because I think I agree. $500 seems ridiculous. $300 seems like a charity case. Where do
yeah,
you think, is it 400 or do you think it's like 350, 430?
400 give or take $30 maybe. It's hard
Yeah.
to say exactly. They have a lot more information on the market than we do. But yeah, around $400 is probably what we're going to see. Not necessarily what we're going to see. What seems reasonable, I guess, at this point.
Where do you see the rest of the lineup kind of lining up? Because I have heard that AMD wants to take market share this generation in a way that they didn't really attempt to with RDNA 2. They did not make as much RDNA 2 as they could have for a few reasons. But like now I hear they want to take market shares. Do you think, and think about what this means too, if it's a $400 6900 XT, that means it's probably not that far away from a $600 4070 in performance. Well, like that's pretty competitive considering how much cheaper it might be. Where do you think they put like a 7700 XT that's probably, stronger than a 3090, 7800 XT, and then their card that's I think around double the performance of a 6900 XT and wildly better ray tracing from what I'm hearing. But again, I'm not going to put an exact number on it. Like, where do you think they're going to price it relative to our hypothetical Lovelace pricing we already talked about?
Say if we're comparing a 4070 and a 7700 XT, and the
Hmm.
7700 XT performs better, beats it in ray tracing and in rasterization, it will not be cheaper,
Hmm.
even if
You
it
think
has
they
less
charge
RAM.
$600 for it? They're like $600 if the 4070 600 as well.
Yeah, unless it loses. If it loses, it'll be cheaper. But if it doesn't lose, if it's like exactly the same, it'll be slightly cheaper. Like sort of like the 3080 and the 6800 XT were trading blows, basically
Hmm.
exactly the same performance and rasterization. And AMD priced it at $50 cheaper. I don't see AMD changing up their strategy too much. If AMD is convincingly beating it, they're going to charge it more. Maybe not a lot more, but they're going to want the price. Like the price sends a message. It's not only
Hmm.
a calculation, it's a statement, right? If the price is lower, it says, we understand we're worse. If they don't think they're worse, if they think they can actually compete, charging a little bit more says, hey, our card is better. We know
Hmm.
our card is better. You should buy our card because it's better. and it's worth a little bit more money. It might be worth, like, the margin by which it wins might be more than the margin by which they charge more.
Hmm. But they're gonna make sure they send that statement, "We're better," and we know we're better.
Exactly.
Joaquim Hagen writes in and says, one more question. NVIDIA and Apple cut production, but AMD seems to be plowing forward with next gen wafer allocation. Is part of the reason that they have a lot of products to allocate the wafers between? Or do you think they're going to try to grab market share this generation, even if it's a even if there's bad market conditions? And I'm just leading into just a blanket question I just had here, which simply is, how do you think it's going to pan out? Do you think AMD is going to take market share this generation? Do you think they really have a chance? How do you think Nvidia is going to be perceived? Because I will say this, I'm sure Nvidia is going to lose efficiency. They're going to, guys. So we know that. But like, how do you think this is all the dust is going to settle on competitiveness and market share this generation? And again, anyone listening, hey, we're having fun here talking about it. We're not, putting our reputations on the line. We're just
Yeah.
spitballing here.
Yeah, I definitely need hardware unboxed's crystal ball.
Hmm.
No, but it's hard to say. What I think is going to happen, I think AMD is improving. Their drivers are in a way better state than they used to be. People are talking a lot less about don't buy AMD because their drivers are awful. People are still saying it though. They're coming off of a good generation. RDNA 2 was good for mindshare. And honestly, it comes down to mindshare, so that's a lot of what I'm talking about. And it takes multiple generations for that mindshare to shift.
Hmm.
Um, so the chances that RDNA 3 beats Lovelace in sales is like nobody's talking about that. It's
I
not going
think
to
me and you
win,
both agree
right?
there's like a almost zero chance of that. But do you think
Yeah.
there's a chance instead of the market share being whatever it is now, which is usually Nvidia has, 70 to 80% of the market at all times. Do you think we
Yeah.
shift down to 30 to 40, like AMD actually gets above a third of market share, or do you think it's going to stay where it is?
I think it's hard to say exactly, but I think AMD has a good chance if they play their cards right. They've got the efficiency. If the ray tracing improves relative to what Nvidia's got, that's important. FSR 2.0 needs to be in more games. FSR 2.0 isn't as good as DLSS, but it's close enough that
Like it is
it
like within like 5% it's like the same thing almost.
it's
In some
yeah.
games
So
it's kind of better.
yes, like honestly, if I've got an Nvidia GPU and I'm playing a game that has both, obviously I'm going to use DLSS. But if I've got an Nvidia GPU and I play a game that only has FSR 2.0, I'm not bitching about it. It's
Hmm.
like, oh hey, cool. I can turn on something that's almost as good. Or if I've got an AMD GPU, um, if I've got that option, it's fine. Like DLSS is better, but um, FSR 2.0 can help mitigate the mind share basically. So given that,
Assuming
if
they assume they get that adoption, then you're saying you think they can
they
take some
they
market
need
share.
they need a lot more games to have FSR 2.0, and they need the ray tracing. They're going to win the efficiency in all likelihood. I don't think efficiency matters that much, but it's one part of the equation. And if they can price things right with performance, they have decent amount of RAM. Like um, there's a decent chance they improve their position relative to the previous generation. Obviously, they're
Hmm.
not going to win.
That's
That would be
basically my
like, yeah,
question too. Is do you
yeah.
think they're going to improve their position relative to
And
last
and
gen?
I think they can. It's going to take time. Just like Ryzen, it doesn't happen overnight. Doesn't happen in one generation. Even if AMD outright wins at everything, it's not happening in one generation.
Hmm.
It's going to take time.
And in many ways, I actually kind of see RDNA 1 and RDNA 2 were pretty close to each other in launches. If you really think about it, RDNA 1 was just a early mid-range launch, followed by the, as people sometimes have called it, the fixed RDNA 1 and RDNA 2, but then they also had Infinity Cache that had a full lineup. Like, I kind of see RDNA 1, RDNA 2 as Zen 1, Zen Plus in a way, except that I know RDNA 2 wasn't just a little better, but I
Yeah,
understand, but they also use more
yeah,
energy. You have to
yeah,
take that into account. And I think that RDNA 3 is going to be kind of like a Zen 2 situation where, well, okay, now the efficiency argument's just gone.
yeah, yeah,
Now they basically win at everything, but I'm sure Nvidia will push one of their cards hard enough where they can claim they've won at something. And I think it's going to take RDNA 4 to be a Zen 3 moment where it's a clean sweep. And the reason I think it would take RDNA 4 is RDNA 3 uses chiplets, but it's like the first time they're trying it, kind of like Zen 2. I think RDNA 4 is going to be the one that really pushes the advantage. And when everyone asks me, because of course now they're already asking me, like, what do you think the RTX 5000 series is going to be? I'm like,
mm,
Blackwell? I honestly, dude, I don't, I'm not paying any attention to it. But my only question with Blackwell is, have they figured out chiplets? Because if they haven't, they've pulled the power consumption lever with Lovelace, and they kind of did already with Ampere. The levers are gone,
yeah,
and 3 nanometers slowing down. What are you
yeah,
going to do, NVIDIA? You're already using the newest node with 4 nanometer, most likely, too. AMD isn't even like, you pulled the node lever, the efficiency lever, you pulled everything, the cooling levers, you pulled all of the cheating levers you can at this point. If you're not on 3 nanometer, I don't think GDR7's doubling performance. I don't know what you're going to do against RDNA 4 early 2024, because I think that's just going to be like a more radical version of RDNA 3 with now AMD is using 4 nanometer. Now they're using even more chiplets in the latest RAM. That is where I think NVIDIA's really in a bind if they don't figure out chiplets. And as far as we can tell, I'm not seeing the telegraphing they're figuring it out, because Hopper is monolithic still. And that kind of was
yeah.
a little
That was a
surprising, right?
surprise. Yeah, I was sure Hopper was going to be NCM, but to be fair, we also early whispers were suggesting that RDNA 3 was going to be MCM, at least in the compute role, also in the compute die, but
Mhm.
now it's not. The compute die is monolithic with IO and other
Mhm.
things like maybe the infinity cache are separated into other dies. So I don't know if it was the case where AMD had designs for both and they went with the the monolithic compute die because it performed better, or
They
if
did have a
they
monolithic design, by the way, a year ago. Um, I was shown evidence of a early RDNA 3 design that had 96 compute units and was monolithic. And I think what they're doing right now is like an MCM version of that, if I'm being entirely honest. That's what it seems very clear to
interesting.
me.
Okay, if AMD pulls off at least what we're hoping to, and Nvidia's still on monolithic,
I don't see where they go. They're maxing out the reticle limit
yeah,
on the newest node using boatloads of
absolutely.
energy.
Yeah,
And you
like
look at
what are
what
they going to
AMD is
do?
doing now, like another telegraph for how ahead AMD is in chiplets is they had, I believe the first one, what was it, like Arcturus with just a gigantic CDNA1 card. And
Yeah,
then we have the MI200 series, which they've kind of figured out two same dies communicating. And then MI300, they've already basically leaked snapshots of the one I leaked, which is like, it's like 12 chiplets, almost Ponte Vecchio looking. That's going to
jeez.
launch. Um, and then if that's what they're doing in the professional market, then what I'm seeing is they're on like third, fourth gen chiplet GPU by late next year. And Nvidia, where's the professional like, you don't even have concepts of a multi-chip design that seems to work. So that's what that is. Again, that's, and I guess what I'm saying is too, my point by bringing all of that up is, I'm not saying Blackwell can't be a chiplet architecture. And who knows? There's also this remote chance that like it's like an Apple situation where they do several generations until it's perfect, and then that's when they move to chiplets. There's a reason to
Mhm.
go monolithic. There's less latency. There are cost benefits to being monolithic. So I would understand
Yep,
if in the background Nvidia is actually on their third gen of chiplets and they don't want to try it until it works well. But
like they're
it's hard for me
developing
to.
it. Yeah,
But it's hard for me to believe they're at the same level as AMD when they have still shown nothing. So even if Blackwell is chiplet based, I would argue it's going to be like chiplet 1.0 versus AMD's chiplet 3.0.
yeah, yeah. AMD definitely seems to be ahead. in the chiplet game, Nvidia is also pretty excellent engineers, though, so they could
Hmm.
pull something out of their ass. It's basically never count Jensen out.
Absolutely never count him out. But again, it's just for me, it's like this is where I sit there and go, I don't think they're going to get a 3 nanometer chip that clocks faster than their 4 nanometer custom node. So I'm really wondering where they go next. But
Yeah, for sure.
let me switch gears again. I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but Amigo Garrigo writes in and he says, "What do you expect the initial price inflation will be for Zen 4 CPUs and motherboards, and how good will the availability be at launch?" And I'm just using this to kind of launch into a discussion about, you have anything to say about Raptor Lake and Raphael, Z790, AM5, that type of thing?
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, everything that I don't have any neat takes on it. I think all my points that I could say have been kind of talked to death. I feel
Mm,
like the initial announcement of Zen 4 was, there was some degree of sandbagging happening. I was pretty vocal on Twitter that it's like, oh, no, I didn't say they're done, but it was like, it was not what I was hoping for. But as more information came out, they're talking about it more. I think it's going to be a really good competition between Raphael and Raptor Lake, both in single core performance and in multi-threaded performance. The question is going to be segmentation and prices. So I don't think AMD is going to be able to get away with an $800 16 core Zen
mhm.
4. I like it would just be the Raphael's i9 is going to be, or not, Raptor Lake's i9 would be cheaper. I mean, they only charge what, $600 typically, and it's
Pretty
probably
much,
going to
yeah.
be around the same performance. So that's probably what AMD can get away with charging, right?
Mhm. I
So
suspect they're gonna charge a little more for the top Raphael, so I don't know what that means. Does that mean $800? I don't think so, and again, a lot of people go, "But it's on 5 nanometer, they have to charge more," and Zen 3's
no, they
margins were
don't.
hilarious. They
Yeah,
really
the
don't have
margins
to.
were crazy. Yeah, they can charge whatever they need to charge. The question is,
They've
what do
actually
they
got a
need to
lot of room.
charge? Yeah,
So, and I think I don't know, yeah, I think they might charge a little more, like $700 or something, but then they're like, "Our platform's cheaper and better." I think that's
yeah.
probably the argument, and then I think you're gonna see things get down and dirty in the mid-range where there's gonna be really heavy pricing competition when they're not flagships. At least that's what I'm expecting.
I think the discussion here is a lot more interesting. Not literally on the CPUs themselves, but on the platforms.
I agree.
Um, because the CPUs are, yeah, they're probably going to be very similar to each other.
They're gonna be very close to performance, guys. I
So
mean, really.
like if you're just looking at the CPU, buy the one you like, or like flip a coin. Like, who cares? But um, the platform's very different. X670E versus Z790. Um,
I
you know,
kinda
they
like B650 Extreme more than Z790, but we're not even I forget, like, it's like, if I look at the design of Z790, as far as I can tell, it's just like, hey, you get like 8 M.2s, but one of them's 3.0, two of them are 3, and then like the rest are 4.0, unless you cut the PCIe lanes in half for the GPU. Meanwhile, with AMD, B650 costs less to make, and yes, you only get like 4 M.2s total. Oh well, at least some of them can be 5.0. You don't need more than 4 M.2s, and the platform costs less. And then X670E is just better. Like it is, it's
yeah.
just a better platform.
So I definitely agree. X670, X670, X670E, it's better. I mean, we talk about X670 versus X670E. That's really, they're the same platform. The difference is, with E, they're requiring the boards implement all of the features of it, right?
Mhm.
Like that's
Which, when I look around, I rechecked one of the data sheets I was set for like an early planned, like a spreadsheet of like what one of the motherboard makers was planning to do for all their models and like how many slots each will have and blah blah blah. And what's interesting is X670 non-E, so the non-extreme, does tend to sacrifice PCIe 5.0 support for the graphics card a lot. But I noticed
Mhm.
a lot of the X670 non-E actually support multiple M.2 PCIe 5.0 drives. So I found that interesting, is that really the main differentiator, if we're being honest about what's different, it is the GPU slot speed. B650 4.0, but you might even get a 5.0 SSD and a normal B650 for like $160, which to me is more important than the GPU slot, kind of. I don't think GPUs
Mhm.
are going to need more than PCIe 4.0 times 16 for a very long time. And the same goes on and on and up the stack. You buy X670E or B650E so you can have the latest GPU slot speed, from what I can tell. And I think that makes it, yeah, it's, I think people care more about that anyways, and again, like, they really are cheaper than I think Z790 is gonna be.
Thing is, I in terms of the PCIe lane, I think I think the reason Z790 made the choice to only have the Gen 4 SSD unless they cut the
Mhm.
GPU in half, I think the reason for that is because they want somewhere to go with the next generation. Because in Intel releases a new chipset with every CPU generation. AMD doesn't necessarily do that. And Intel also only does two generations per socket. But I saw a meme with Yoda talking about Intel sockets, two
Mhm.
there are, no more, no less.
And that's what, Meteor Lake's LGA 1851. It just seems
Exactly.
like, yeah.
Yeah. So what we know is this is going to be the last CPU on the socket, and there's going to be uh, a new chipset and a new socket for the next generation after this coming one. Which means I think Intel is just thinking, well, they want to be able to add some sort of feature every generation.
Mm.
Um, and I think they're kind of counting on, like, I went and looked at what the performance difference on, various generations of PCIe for GPU, and honestly, it doesn't matter that much. Like, if you're sacrificing half of your PCIe 5.0, like even if you're running a 4.0 GPU um, at by 8, hell, there was people running. Well, there was tests. There was a TechSpot review that I just went and looked at because I was curious what the difference in a 3080 running
Mhm.
even as low as PCIe 3.0 by 8, and you only get more than a 5% difference in performance if you're well over 300 FPS.
Mhm. Do you think that's just a result of current games, though, and like you're playing just a little bit with fire? And obviously, this is the classic future proofing. Half the time, it doesn't pan out how you think it will, anyways. But I do remember people making similar arguments when 3.0 first came out with the 7970. And yes, it was like 4 years later or something, but there were a couple games that just the performance fell apart in some games at lower bandwidths. I mean, and I'm not saying that's going to happen to all cards, but a 3080 is a flagship right now, so it's not weak. It's conceivable.
I mean, I suppose it's fair to consider probably the biggest thing that's going to use the PCIe lanes a lot more going into the future is storage. When the
Hmm.
GPUs are using direct storage and requesting a lot more data a lot faster from the GPU. So we're going to see PCIe 3.0 speeds quickly not be enough as the GPUs use those. But I think a misconception that's pretty common is, if you have a GPU that's twice as fast, well, now you need a PCIe lane that's twice as fast.
Which is definitely not true.
No, it doesn't work like that. It's But there's a lot of factors that go into what use the PCIe lanes. Like something that actually does use the PCIe lanes a lot more, and this could actually be a big issue on like Navi 33. If you don't have enough RAM and you have a very
Mm.
fast GPU, it's going to offload that RAM to your system RAM, and then it's going to be requesting that from your system RAM, and that puts a far greater load on your PCIe bus.
One thing I want to bring up, though, that I see as the biggest issue for Z790 is just how they price it. So I don't think me or you entirely disagrees with the decision they made for PCIe 5.0 support. That's fine. But like I said earlier, I truly do think that I would recommend B650E over Z790 if they were the same price, if it gave you one, a 5.0 SSD slot and it still had like three 4.0 SSD slots. Like I'm looking at a chart next to me right now of like what some of these motherboards from one of the board makers, and yeah, so one of them is around $300 is the plan, and it has a Gen 5 times 16. It has three M.2s for 5.0 and a one 4.0. Now, I'm guessing what that means is only one or two of those can be 5.0, but you can have like three 4.0s unless you cut the lanes in half. But wh- if one's $300, and I think Z790 is going to often be $300, would you not take the one that cannot cut your lanes in half to give you a 5.0 SSD? And I mean, you see what I'm saying though? Like, how is Intel going to price this if I don't see, at least from what I've seen, any X670Es that cost over 500 right now? I'm sure there will be a couple, right? But I don't see any right now, and most of them seem to be 300 to 400. 670 X670 non-E is like 300, like 250 to 350, and then your B650s get all the way down to $120. Like, how do you price Z790 then? Because it kind of has to be the same or less than Z690, no?
Yeah, that's basically kind of the important difference. Obviously, uh, Intel's working with kind of fewer features. That their platform isn't as good, but in ways that don't matter as much. So they have to, yeah, they can't be too much more expensive. Um, you have to basically do the math with the cost of the motherboard and the CPUs together. So if they end up really, the CPU plus motherboard being a lot more expensive than CPU plus motherboard for AMD, they're going to have a really hard time selling
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to be so competitive. That being said, there's also another factor that we have to consider is the platform longevity. This
Mm-hmm.
is a dead end socket for Intel, but for AMD is the first generation of a socket that likely is going to last a long time. So
Mm-hmm.
if you buy the AMD platform, yeah, okay, you're probably spending a little bit less on the platform maybe compared to Intel, and you're getting some features. You'll be able to have the full 5.0 16 on the GPU, and 5.0 SSDs and all of that, sure, but you also be able to 4 years from now be able to pop in a Zen 7 CPU. Maybe I'm not confirmed, but
I
like
would say probably at least Zen 6, but yeah.
maybe Zen 6, but that's still like multiple generations. You're thinking, so like I just replaced my 2700X with a 5800X 3D, just a drop-in replacement. Didn't
Mm-hmm.
replace the RAM, didn't replace the motherboard.
Dan, co-host is Broken Silicon's probably going to do that too.
Yeah, just literally 2700X, boom, 5800X 3D. Nothing else. Like, I was literally able to overspend on the CPU because I didn't have to replace the RAM or the board. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
probably wouldn't have spent that much on the CPU if I had to do anything else. And my RAM isn't even good. I've got crappy old RAM from 2017, but the V cache on the 5800X 3D makes it so you basically, like, your RAM doesn't really matter. I mean, to a certain extent. Maybe if it was like 2133, it would be worse. But like
But so think
it's
of all these different factors that I've been trying to highlight in my recent content. I believe will make AM5 and Zen 4 far more appealing than it was initially given credit. And to be fair,
yeah,
I think AMD's reveal of the Zen 4 was odd at the least. But
yeah, it was
like,
odd.
let's at least like I just want to call this out. It to me seems like a lot of the perceived disappointment a lot of people have so far with Zen 4 seems to come from this built-in assumption that AMD has to crush Intel every generation now. Because it's so funny how back with Zen Plus, Zen 2, Zen 3, it was like, what if they win by 5%? That's crazy. And
Yeah,
now if Zen 4 ties Raptor Lake, it's a disaster? Like what has
yeah,
happened in one generation? The expectations for AMD have gone so high that if they don't win at everything by 20%, it's bad. I don't think it needs to win at everything by 20%. And I think AM5 and Zen 4 launches first. So who's going to wait like 2 months to buy a Raptor Lake CPU that uses more energy on a worse platform that costs more, that's on a dead end socket? Who's waiting
yeah,
2 months for that?
yeah,
What if it wins by 10% against Zen 4? Whatever.
yeah.
I don't know. Who cares?
Yeah, honestly, I agree entirely. AMD is just fine. And even without that, Intel has this perception over the past several years that they've been getting their ass kicked. And not only getting their ass kicked, but like it's not even that people don't see Intel as having been doing great things and AMD's just doing better. It's
Mm.
that AMD's been doing great and Intel has been just sucking time and time again. Alder Lake is an exception. Alder Lake they
Mhm.
delivered. Alder Lake's great. I can't say too much bad about Alder Lake other than it uses a lot of energy, but um,
But not
that
even that
was
much, really, if you break it down. It's pretty impressive just overall.
yeah, like the 12700 is actually very reasonable. People look at like the 12900. It's like, oh, look at this 240 watt. Like it's crazy. It's so hard to cool, and then just assume that applies to everything else. No, it doesn't. It's actually pretty reasonable. And in gaming, a lot of the time, you're not smashing the CPU under like a synthetic load during gaming, and it's actually just fine. But other than that, Intel has like generation after generation of failing to really impress, and people were just sick and tired of the same old and missed promises and delayed products and like people AMD's or Intel's mindshare is really slipping, and mindshare matters a lot. AMD controls the mindshare now on the CPU space, which is kind of crazy to say, but it's
But they
kind
do, at least in
they
enthusiast
do.
circles, they do.
So, AMD doesn't have to win. Now we're in a position
Exactly.
where Intel's the one that has to win to really claim that back. It's the opposite of what the GPUs are like I said earlier, Radeon versus Nvidia. If Radeon is better in every way and cheaper, Nvidia is still going to sell
Mm.
more cards. That's just not the case with the CPUs with AMD versus Intel. Intel is now the underdog, and they're the ones that people are waiting on, expecting them to deliver well if they want their money, or if they want their business. And I think Intel knows this and they're trying, but it's
One thing I want to touch on to nip the rest of this, like, kind of AMD and Intel conversation. Actually, it's touched on by a reader mail here. Joachim Hagen writes, and he says, "Hey, Tom and Meyer, in the earlier days of the Moore's Law's Dead channel, I remember Tom saying a couple of OG times, it's not a bad product, only a bad price. With Intel falling behind on products, can they keep up with pricing because they own their own fabs?" And I bring this up because I've actually gotten this from some of my Intel contacts recently who started arguing with me like, oh, well, it doesn't matter if Zen 4 wins, it's going to cost more and we're always going to be able to undercut them. And I don't know if these people have paid attention to their own company's earnings calls, where quarter after quarter, investors in Intel have been recently asking when are margins going back up. Intel's actually getting hammered by a lot of their investors right now that their
yeah.
margins are lower than they were 5 years ago.
That being said, Intel's going to do what it has to. Um, Even if the investors are on their ass to increase margins, if I mean, it would be better for like Intel's not going to overcharge for a product and have it not sell and just be absolute fools on the marketplace. That's
Hmm.
not going to happen.
Yeah, the
Um,
i9 $600. We've seen this. They're not overcharging.
yeah. So like it's investors want better margins, but that's on Intel's development, their R&D. It's about delivering the products. But in terms of when those products get to market, Intel's going to charge for them what they need to charge in order for those to make sense on the market, and they will
But
be at
you
the
see what I'm
prices
getting
that
at,
make them
though,
make
right?
sense. Yeah, I totally agree
Because I
with
think some
you.
people are acting like AMD is just going to be priced out of the market by Intel. And I'm like, I don't think
No.
it's that simple. Intel's actually been under a lot of fire lately in earnings calls.
Yeah,
I think you're not going to see Intel go crazy anytime soon. But at the same time, I think where Intel is right now with pricing, I don't think they're getting cheaper. I don't think they can really afford to without getting in trouble. Or do you disagree? Because I'm just saying, like, the earnings calls are getting pretty heated right now. They're like, hey, you said you'd be back up to normal margins by now. And now they're saying, oh, we will in 2024. And now I'm hearing Meteor Lake is delayed. And I'm like, will you? I
yeah,
don't
but
know.
those earnings calls. I mean, actually, there's in business circles, there's weirdly a lot more emphasis on the margins than like year over year earnings. Like how much
Mm.
money are you actually making? Um, which is kind of weird. Like it's the sort of mindset that leads companies to uh, like collude with each other and do price fixing because their share prices are more dependent on the price of the thing that they're selling than it is by how much market share and how much money they're actually making. So if they sell a lot less, but what they're selling, they sell for a lot more, they're worth a lot more.
Even if their market share is way lower. Well, it's because these
Yeah,
investors see that and they're thinking long term. Like, if they can't hold good margins, what's the point in them taking market share? That's why they think that.
exactly. But it becomes a gamified system that doesn't actually make sense if you take a step back and examine the whole situation. Um, so that was a bit of a criticism on a lot of these investors that probably aren't listening to me anyway. But
But don't you think Intel's probably at least under the spotlight a little bit to catch back up in performance now because they can't afford to be they're at much lower margins than they've traditionally been at for the past decade for a few years now. And the promise they made to investors is this is temporary. We'll be back by 2024. And again, I'm just kind of leading into when I hear about Meteor Lake, LGA 1851 potentially slipping to 2024. I'm like, I don't know that margins are getting better if you expect to price Meteor Lake against Zen 5 guys. I don't think so.
yeah, that's an unfortunate situation. But I do think that the conversation about margins, the executive lineup of Intel will know that they need their products to sell in order to keep making money, to build their war chest, to be able to continue developing new products. That means they will, even with the investor pressure for higher margins, um, the way Intel is going to take that investor pressure and translate that to communication inside the company is not going to be the products that we have charge more for them. It will be pressure to make products that they can charge more for in the future.
Hmm.
Um, so I think Intel still will, even with that investor pressure for higher margins,
Even with a fire lit under them.
even with the fire lit under them, they will still, if they have to, in
They
order
will.
to sell more products and make money in general, like make
Hmm.
make more sales and make more money, they will charge what they have to for the products in order for them to sell.
Can we agree on this though? Okay, so we're saying Intel will do whatever they need to keep market share as much as possible, which I agree. But that doesn't mean they're going to try to lower prices unless they need to. Like they don't
Oh
want to
no,
get in a
for
pricing
sure.
war.
Yeah, no.
Because there are some people that act like, oh, they're just going to do what they need to price AMD out of the market. And it's like, I don't think they're going to be the instigator of a pricing war anytime soon because they don't want that.
It's not going to be a pricing war. It's going to be kind of what we see with Intel and in or AMD and Nvidia. AMD used to be, try to be in the instigator of a pricing war. That never went well for them. And they've started pricing maybe just under
Hmm.
Nvidia. And I think that's sort of the behavior that we can expect from Intel, where they're still gonna charge as much as they can get away with, but they're also not going to charge too much so that they don't sell.
Right, because
Yeah.
I think like a Raptor Lake i5, which should be 6 cores, 6 big cores, 8 little cores, the top K one at least.
Yeah, that'll be good.
I don't think they're gonna go to 250, guys. I think they're gonna stay 300 to 350, and they're gonna leave room for AMD to have a decent 8 core at a similar price. I don't think they're gonna try to undercut AMD by $100 because they are running into margin issues now that they didn't have before, and they can't afford to you know, they don't want a war of attrition right now. They want to just slowly climb back.
Even if we look at like the market right now between Zen 3 and Alder Lake, like the i5s are winning in gaming, but the difference in productivity is actually like pretty huge. The
Mhm.
i5s are matching the i7s in productivity because of those e-cores. And if the next generation has even more e-cores, then AMD is going to be the one that's forced to respond with
Mhm.
different segmentation in order to match that. Otherwise, they'll just look bad, or it'll be a case where, oh, if you're just gaming, maybe you can get. If you're just gaming and you're not literally buying the flagship products or the Halo products, then you sort of go with Intel. AMD kind of has to combat that approach
Well, I
with
think
more
we we've
cores.
we've kind of seen already what they're going to do when you look at the 5700X with the same MSRP as the 5600X, right? So I think what we're going to see is a probably a 7700X for 300 with 8 cores with
Yeah,
Zen
we
4.
might.
That's my guess. And then you're going to see like a 70s 800X 3D for 400 or something. Something like that is what I think is likely because they've already kind of telegraphed what they can do. And I do think it's time they start moving those core count prices down. Greasy, what's wrong? Heat getting you down? No? You're paying too much for Windows keys? Well, come on, you know you don't have to do that by now. After all, it's certainly been no secret that CDKeyOffer.com has been a reliable sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead for years. They're the go-to place that I recommend my fans use for getting PlayStation, Microsoft Office, and Windows operating system keys for reasonable prices. You don't want to spend a ridiculous amount of the percentage of your build's price on a Windows operating system. Go to CDKeyOffer.com to get a legitimate, reliable key to build your new system without wasting too much money. I use them to make the Alder Lake system next to me for benchmarking graphics cards, and if I build a Zen 4 or Raptor Lake system this fall, you can bet I will be going to CDKeyOffer.com right away to get a reasonably priced Windows 11 key. If you do go to CDKeyOffer.com, make sure you use the offer code BrokenSilicon to get 25% off Windows software and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else on the website. They even sell gaming chairs, mice, and keyboards right now. It's a good place to go to get reasonably priced products and to also show your support for Moore's Law is Dead. Go to cdkeyoffer.com today. I want to switch gears here a little bit to the consoles, which is actually why we reached out to each other, or why you reached out as a possible thing to talk about. First, we've spent so much time on the other stuff. Falto writes in and he says, as of now, what are the most likely performance targets for a next gen Xbox Series X up refresh or a PS5 Pro?
This is a hard question, and with all of the talk of the next gen consoles, I haven't come up with a good answer for this. It's difficult to think because it's actually a lot easier for Xbox. Xbox uses DirectX, and as far as game development, you can basically just throw hardware at it and console go burr. But with PlayStation, that's simply not the case. PlayStation uses a much lower level API, and that lower level API, the effect of it is the developers spend a lot more time, or at least they can, in some cases do spend a lot more time doing like low level hardware optimizations to get more out of the PS5. Often they don't. In most multi-platform games, they don't. But a lot of PS5 exclusives, they will do that. Which
and I'd
means
say half of the third-party games, there's a couple to the metal things in there. It's just not like they put a ton into the whole thing, and half of them don't do any optimization, really.
Yeah. So when looking at where PlayStation is going with the PS5 Pro, like you have to take into account they don't want to piss off their developers. They need development to be as smooth as possible. They don't want to have to like basically do two completely different sets of optimization. So what can they do? With the PS4 Pro, what they did is they had a very simple approach that was very much led by a desire to target 4K. You know, when the PS4 came out, it was a 1080p, often, 900p or whatever, but it was a 1080p console.
Their target was 1080p 30 pretty clearly.
Yeah. And then by the PS4 Pro, the only thing they changed, like they overclocked the CPU, but it was the same garbage CPU. They overclocked the RAM a little bit, but not by a whole lot. They still had a hard drive in there, even though SSDs were affordable at that point. The only thing they changed was the GPU, because the goal, you don't need a faster CPU to go from 1080p to 4K. All you need is a faster GPU, and that's all they did. That's the only change they made with the PS4 Pro. And so the design, when they went in, the goal of the hardware, what they went and said, we need to hit 4K. So you see that in the marketing, you see that in the design, you see that's what they delivered, was a 4K PS4.
4K.
4K, yeah. I mean, same way the PS4 was 1080p,
save you from
right?
the comments. People are going, oh, I think it's worse than the PS4 1080p.
Yeah,
now I think Horizon is 1080p, if I remember correctly. But
yeah, I mean,
no, 4K, they really were rarely 4K.
I mean, there was a lot of checkerboarding and whatever else. And I think any time it did actually hit 4K, it might have been checkerboarding. But the checkerboarding upscale,
there's a couple games that did, but it was usually with some caveat, or it was a really easy to run game. And I think they even built hardware custom. They did some custom tweaks to the silicon to specifically run checkerboarding efficiently, even. It was like from the beginning they were like, this is checkerboarding. But you mentioned this to me though. You think that they might do a similar thing with FSR 3.0. Or at least someone mentioned that to me. Maybe it was a contact. I don't remember if I talked to you about that. Probably wasn't you, now that I think about it.
Yeah, I don't think it was me.
Well, there's recent rumors that RDNA 3 really does have some new tweaks in the silicon for like an almost tensor core like approach. And this might be used to accelerate FSR 3.0. And what I've had someone suggest to me recently is that you could see a situation where it is literally kind of a PS4 Pro situation. So a newer version of GCN is what they did for PS4 Pro. They doubled the compute units that time around. I don't know if this time around, because RDNA 3, it's different. I don't think they needed double compute units to double performance. And they now may have a hardware accelerated FSR variant coming out. If they have that, it's quite conceivable, just like they had tweaks in the silicon for checkerboarding, they plan for FSR 3.0 being like, no, it's mandated. Every game uses FSR 3.0 from the get-go in the API if it's if it's optimized, shall we say, with a PS5 Pro enhancement. Like, and if you combine that with, say, like a little bit faster RAM, some new tweaks from the newer architectures, I think they can get you something that's kind of similar to what they did with the PS4 Pro without increasing the BOM cost too much. Although now there's inflation, so it might be an excuse to charge more.
But my big question with the PS5 Pro is, what is the actual goal? With the PS4 Pro, it was going from 1080p to 4K. Um, for those listening audio, every time I've said 1080p or 4K, I've been like massive finger quotes. But I mean, the PS5 box literally already says 8K on it, and 8K isn't a big marketing thing yet. So, what is the design goal of a PS5 Pro? Like, in the boardroom when they're sitting around going, "Okay, we're going to make a PS5 Pro. What are we designing for? What is the reason? What is the goal that this thing should achieve in games over the PS5? What is it? I don't know."
I've got a few though. I think it's an excuse to charge more. I mean, honestly, inflation's really hit them hard. Like, you notice Sony made these reports came out where Sony's like, we're breaking even on the PS5 already, and then they haven't said that again. The second RAM prices went up because they're probably not breaking even again. And
Yeah, they
I've
might
had
not be.
a lot of my contacts have said like they kind of need an excuse to charge more for the disc version is one reason they might do it. Another reason is last gen, they didn't care that much about Xbox. They were selling crazy well. Xbox really was failing to compete. This time, Xbox is competing. So the reason
It
they may
is,
do
yeah.
it is they have to. And it's kind of like, why would Lovelace launch this year if they need to get rid of a lot of stock? Because they have to compete with RDNA 3. They're not competing in a vacuum. So I think that's why they would do it. The thing is, I keep leaning towards it making more sense for it to be a cheaper, sooner, not a elaborate thing. Like these
Mhm.
ideas of like of like PC gamer wet dream checklists of things to add to it. I go,
Sure.
I think they want to double performance at the same price and charge a little more even.
Sure, but okay, so the PS5 Pro, let's assume it's happening. Let's assume, market pressure. They're looking over at Xbox, who's probably doing the same thing. They're gonna release a mid-gen that's faster. So the PS5 Pro is happening. Let's assume. Now you're in that board meeting with a bunch of engineers in the room. You still have to figure out, like, what is the target for, like, are you trying to run all of the same games, instead of, at 30 fps, you're now running them at 60 fps? Because if that's the goal, then the CPU could be a limiter in a lot of cases, and changing the CPU massively changes how you approach optimization and, um, you know changes the APIs with the PS5. Like, it's really really difficult for them to make any big changes to the CPU because of.
I don't think it will be though. I think they just go with again my suspicion, although I could certainly be wrong. There's so many different things they can do for different
Mhm.
reasons, but like if I was in the boardroom, I would be advocating for an RDNA 3 Zen 3 Plus 6 nanometer thing that just attempts to make the same thing better for the same price and doesn't go crazy. And then I think you just market 4K 120. Like you put
Mhm.
120 on the box, and if you look at LG's new OLED TVs, in fact, those new OLED TVs can now hit 138 hertz. It's just hilarious to me seeing
Yeah.
like a mainstream TV manufacturer actually kind of get that people are buying these for gaming and they're like
Yeah.
not going to sit around at 120 hertz. That's what I think it is. I think they go, we double graphics performance, we increase, and last gen they couldn't make the CPU better. Let's be honest, they couldn't. Like AMD was dead in the water. This generation they can. They can go from 3.4 gigahertz to 4 gigahertz with Zen 3 Plus. And if you do that, you're probably about doubling performance. And you don't really need a double performance to hit 120. It's okay if it drops to 110 every now and then. Like, I think that's what they aim for. And they're like, hey, if you have a 4K 60 TV, just get a normal PS5 Slim now for $400. It's fine. This is what you want. But if you have one of those new 4K 120 TVs, and surprisingly, almost every TV now seems to have a 120 hertz option. This is why you pay the extra $100 for a PS5 Pro. Maybe they add more storage too. They're like, this is the premium enthusiast gaming experience for $600. I think that's the selling point. And again, this is not in a vacuum. It's so they can launch something that markets 4K 120 before the Xbox refresh comes out, so that they're not the first ones to advertise it. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's possible. I still think it's really unlikely that we see a different CPU in it. Certainly, there won't be a difference in storage.
I think
First of all,
more
there's
storage, but they're not going to. Yeah, no, I don't think they're going
more
to change how the
more
SSD
storage for
works.
sure. Yeah. More storage for sure, but not the speed, not the type of storage.
If the SSD is clocked faster, it's because it has to be, because they can't manufacture it slower. I don't think they're going to put any money into clocking it faster.
Yeah, no, and the thing is, every single case of consoles we've seen have, like, the Xbox Series X and S, the Xbox One S and One X, and the PS4 and PS4 Pro. They all have, the slow to the fast version. To be fair, all of those examples are 1080p to 4K, which makes me like, it's hard to design a PS5 that's not going to piss off the engineers, that's not going to require a bunch more optimization. Like, I
So
don't know.
here's my answer to that, though, is why are we so sure it's going to be that hard for them? I mean, with the PS4 Pro, they added FP16. It was a newer architecture, and I asked one of my contacts about something you said to me offline, which was this idea that I think isn't a bad thought. Like, you know, how hard is this backwards compatibility thing going to be? Because the way Sony handles it is like analog to the metal backwards compatibility. It is
Yeah,
not this, abstracted DirectX layer. And he said, I mean, I think he said to me, dude, the PS5 is an RDNA 2 chip that can run GCN1 code to the metal. I don't see why putting it to RDNA 3 is going to make that any harder. RDNA 3 doesn't drop GCN compatibility. So that was his explanation, is that it really wouldn't be as hard as you think. Now, he's not 100% sure. Even people I talked to at AMD aren't 100. No one's 100% sure than like a team lead at AMD.
right.
That's the only people that are 100% sure. But
Yeah,
I don't know that it's that hard to keep compatibility if they've already done RDNA 2 to GCN1. There'd probably be some features stripped out that they don't think it needs for backwards compatibility reasons. Because they already did do some things for thermal balancing that were really interesting for the PS5. Interesting if you're a dork, not interesting for most
right.
people. But like, they stripped out these things that really are only useful for running calculations that they never run when running a game.
Right.
Because they were like, it like gave them a 5% more consistent thermal load. They're
Yeah.
like, who really cares? I would guess there's some things they strip out for compatibility reasons, though. I would.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, yeah, I originally was entirely convinced that the PS5 Pro is not happening, just because, like, they're already at 4K. It makes more sense, if they really want to push a new set of hardware, to just go uh to just do a PS6 a little bit sooner. And it's sort of the same with when people were talking about the Switch Pro. Like, I was always like, guys, the Switch Pro isn't happening.
Hmm.
And I turned out to be right there. Like, if in
I
2020,
think I agree with you on that too. I think I did too. I don't remember ever being convinced there would be a Switch Pro when they can just do a new Switch.
Kimmy and Greymon, I don't know if Greymon, but for sure Kopite 2 Kimmy was releasing multiple, like, these are the specs of the Switch Pro in, like, 2020. And I'm like, no. I don't know who told this person that, but it's not happening. That's not a real thing. the Switch Pro is not happening, mainly because Nintendo doesn't give a shit. Like, they are on
Mhm.
1080p,
Mhm.
and they could make a
Oh,
4K
kinda.
Switch Pro.
Yeah, they're
They're
kinda
like
on
almost
1080p.
at
They're, like,
1080p.
on 900p. They're on 720p, let's just be
Yeah,
honest.
right. But the thing is, Nintendo plays by their own rules, and they don't care. They they could just put a bigger GPU in there for like going towards 4K. The thing is, they don't care. They have never cared. Why would they start caring now and release a Pro that supports something that they don't care about? What they do care about is more console sales, because unlike PlayStation and Xbox, they actually they make money on the sale of each unit. So they unlike so PlayStation and Xbox want as many people as possible to have a PlayStation or an Xbox because they make margins on the
Mhm.
software. But if you already have a PS5, PlayStation does not care about selling you another one because they don't make a
Mhm.
lot of money. They often lose money on selling you that other hardware. What they want you to have is some hardware so they can sell you the software. Nintendo wants both. They want to sell you the
Mhm.
hardware and the software. So they want
Well, and I also
Nintendo.
think I think that there's a clear, and I'll just make this section the Nintendo Switch 2 discussion. Like, I
Sure.
think there's a clear mindset with the engineers at Sony and Microsoft where they go, what technology is out at the time? What are developers asking for? We
Mhm.
built a console based on what min-maxing price performance
Yeah.
for that year. Like,
Yeah.
whereas I think Nintendo goes, it has to do this. That's literally it. Make it as cheap as possible. And they don't care. The fact that they used Maxwell with the Switch in 2017 should tell everybody everything they need to know. Maxwell hit the performance target they wanted, and they said, good enough. They didn't even pay 10 extra dollars to put Pascal in it. They wouldn't
Yeah.
budge. They're like, Nvidia, we want the cheapest one. And they did the same with the Wii U. They had a target. They wanted to be a little better than a PS3. And because of that, they had a 1.3 gigahertz CPU for some reason, even though it probably would have cost them nickels to make it 2 gigahertz or something. And that really held them back. So
Yeah.
when I look at what they're going to do with the Switch 2, I'm almost exclusively looking at what's possible and then bumping it down because I don't
Yeah.
think it's about price performance. I think we just
They
go,
don't care.
it, it's going to use a custom version of Orin or Atlan. It's just going to be whatever that NVIDIA SoC is, a custom version of whatever they can make use 10 watts. That's it.
Yep. And if Nintendo can save a buck and have it be half as fast, they'll probably do it. The reason Nintendo is going to make a Switch 2 is when Switch sales start declining a little bit, they want a new shiny piece of hardware to start making games for, so that all of those Switch owners can now go out and buy this new hardware. That's why they did the OLED, hoping, the OLED was barely an upgrade, but a lot of people, it was a new thing that they could charge more for. And also, it was just enough to be slightly better in some ways, so that some people were looking at their old Switches going, oh, this doesn't have an OLED screen. I could have a Switch with an OLED screen.
I mean, I think it's the same as like why Sony might launch a PS5 Pro. It's so they can keep charging $500 for something that costs effectively the same to make.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at what the Switches are selling for now, it continues to it shouldn't, because I've been watching this for 20 years with Nintendo, but
Yeah.
it still kind of blows me away. They're getting away selling 350 for something that probably costs $100 to make. Like, I'm just
Yeah.
sitting there going, oh my God, this is like a 5-year-old smartphone processor with 3 gigs of RAM. You can get smartphones for $100 with these specs.
Yeah.
This is so profitable per unit right now. Why did
Yeah.
they add the OLED? So they can keep charging 350 because it probably costs them 5 more bucks to give a nicer screen.
Yep. That being said, with the Switch 2, I do think there is one design goal that they're going to have with it.
That's what I was going to ask is like, what is the minimum specs you think it needs to meet whatever they're trying to do?
So let's first talk about what they're trying to do before we can talk about what specs are required
Mhm.
to achieve that. And I think what they're going to try to do is they'll want the next Steam Deck to not be able to emulate its games better than it can run them natively.
Because it's already kind of getting there with the current Steam Deck. Yeah,
Well, no, the
good
Steam
point.
Deck, the Steam Deck, not almost, no, the Steam Deck does run Switch games better than the Switch does through emulation.
I haven't paid attention to that, but I think I did see an article pop up arguing that or showing that. So yeah, I mean, that's honestly kind of pathetic.
So the Steam Deck is 3 to 4 times as fast as the Switch, which means emulation is pretty efficient. There's not a ton. Obviously there's performance loss while emulating, but Nintendo, because they want people to buy their hardware and buy their software, but I think Nintendo's looking at the Steam Deck as a possibility or indication of what could happen more in the future. There's a lot of hype around the Steam Deck. A lot of people, there's not a lot of sales with the Steam Deck necessarily, and it's not very attractive of a console to look at. But it's an idea that Nintendo doesn't like, that I would suspect that they don't like. And I would see Nintendo cracking down even harder on emulation going forward, and also making it more difficult to emulate. And one way to make it more difficult to emulate is by having faster hardware. That doesn't mean that I think they're going to overnight suddenly care about hardware and make insanely fast, handheld as fast as they can make it. No, they're still going to want to make money on the sell of each console from day one. But they're probably thinking more about having a little bit faster just to make emulation less convenient.
Right. And so I think it sounds like we might agree on this. I think their goal is to be able to argue their device is stronger than the Steam Deck a little. That's it. I don't
Yeah,
think they need to crush the
yeah.
Steam Deck. Do you think their goal is at all though, like minimum run next gen games? Like, because that's always the thing that's annoyed me to no end is it's like if they made the Switch 1 Pascal and gave it 4 or 6 gigs of RAM, just that little bit extra, they could have run all PS4 games. They could
Yeah,
have. Like they
yeah.
needed like 1 more gig of RAM and like slightly more grunt to be able to easily. Yes, it would run at like half the settings of an Xbox One, but whatever. It would just pay $10 and let it run the latest games. It's mind blowing to me. Do you think they'll pay the extra $10 this time so that they can say, "Oh, it's like the performance of a 1650 that can do DLSS and ray tracing." That way, whatever the PS5 and Series X are doing at 1800p, we're gonna do it like 1080p with DLSS turned on and have just enough RAM to do it. Do you think that or not? Because when you say you don't think it's gonna have 16 gigs of RAM, I go, 16 gigs is more than enough to be able to run all next gen games if they did it. But do you think I think 8 gigabytes would be a slap in the face. Like, where do you think that lands?
Well, the Xbox Series X has 10 gigabytes, and it's expected to run all next
Series S.
generation games. Series S, yeah, has
Yeah,
10
and devs are
gigs.
already complaining about that, by the way. So 10's definitely the minimum.
Devs are complaining about it, but it's there. Like that's what they have to work with. And even if they release a new Series S replacement, those old Series S's that are out now still have to run it.
Yeah.
And so, and also you have to look at, like, they got The Witcher 3 running on the Switch pretty well. It doesn't look as good, but it runs.
And it's
it's
missing entire areas that it can't run. Running
Yeah.
is up for debate.
So
But
anyway, I suspect that one of the things that Nintendo's going to do, well, one thing that I would like them to do, and they might have to do, considering the entire rest of the industry is moving that way, is much faster storage. Nintendo's been using, like, they haven't been on hard drives, but their games, like the cartridge speeds, have not really been better than a hard drive anyway, because the hard drive has been the goal, like the benchmark that basically all games are running off of. So there's no reason for the Switch hardware to support faster storage speeds than that. And with Nintendo, I use the term storage, and it refers to onboard storage, or the cards, or the cartridges that the games are loaded on actually directly. Because Nintendo, unlike everyone else, can actually run the game directly off of the card as you're playing it. Say if you have a PS5 and you buy a game, before you can play that game, you have to download it from the game onto the console, like from the disc onto the console, because it can't run that game from the spinning disc fast enough. I don't think Nintendo is ever going to require that you download a game from the physical thing that you bought before you can play it. Nintendo's
like
going to want,
and whatever reasons.
Nintendo's going to want you to be able to plug in your game and play, because Nintendo's more about sort of that like kid-friendly experience.
The traditional way you operate a console.
Yeah,
you put the disc
tradition.
in, you put the slot in, the cartridge in, and it runs.
And off you go. Like
you think they go with like USB, like some kind of like proprietary version of like a USB 3.1 cartridge that's fast enough to operate like a slow SSD? That's what you're thinking they're going to do?
Yeah, I think they're going to do fast cartridges so that they can load these new games. I think they're going to have actual internal SSDs in them. I think that's going to be a big thing, because the current Switches have 64 gigabyte eMMCs. And eMMC is just garbage storage. Like it's small and crappy. So I think they're going to have nothing like a PS5 SSD, but I think they're going to have internal SSDs with maybe 250 gig or something like that, maybe 2 gigabyte per second.
I would rule out just 32 gig. It's Nintendo. They may just do 32 gigs, but have an option to get a cartridge that's 64 if you need it. And if you ask me, I think 64 is actually enough. A dev will find a way to fit it in there.
For the cartridges, yeah.
You're saying built into the console?
I think built into the console, they're going to have more storage because more people want to buy games online. And yeah, with the Switch, like you have to, like a lot of the time, if you download a game, you basically need to buy an external SD card to fit those games onto it, because the Switch, the internal storage of the Switch is just too anemic for most games. Like in a lot of cases, if you have one game on the Switch, that's it.
Well, let me skip ahead a bit here and say, I mean, I'm working on a Switch 2 update leak, and I guess what I'm willing to disclose early is it does sound like it's probably launching within 12 months. Now, that may surprise you to hear that, but we've already had rumors of them stopping production of the old Switch and like stockpiling like 20 million. So I think they're already preparing for this transition early. And so if we were to launch at the end of this year, so it sounds like you're saying you don't think 16 gigs, but when I look at the Orin NX, I think what Nvidia and Nintendo are going to do is take a custom Orin NX, which is a 1024 CUDA core, 128-bit LPDDR5. Honestly, when I look at the performance of it, actually, this is going to make me laugh. Isn't that literally the same amount of SMs as... Yeah, it's 8 SMs. It's the same as almost the Steam Deck, but NVIDIA. It's an 8 SM 128 LPDDR5, 128-bit LPDDR5. I think, what is this? Depending on how many you give it. Yeah, 8-core CPU. APU, I think that's kind of where it is. And if you look at what the configurable TDPs on this are, it says 10 to 25 watts. So I think they take something like this, if it's made on Samsung 8 nanometer. The only thing I would throw at you is, do you think there's any chance they take the AGX version, which is the 2048 CUDA core one, but it's manufactured on TSMC?
No, I don't think there's any chance. But particularly, that makes it even less likely. So it's a bigger GPU on a more expensive manufacturing plant.
Probably not 5 nanometer, but it'd probably be on like 6 nanometer. And so it would still have efficiency benefits over Samsung 8 nanometer.
Yeah, it would have efficiency benefits, but it would be a lot more expensive, and Like, again, the Switch used Maxwell. Like, you have to even thinking about Nintendo wants these things to be harder to emulate. You have to like remember that it's still Nintendo. They
Hmm.
they they, they want to make as much money as possible on these things. They're not going to go crazy with specs. Like
And Samsung
especially
8 nanometer would mean they can just spit out tons of them without competing with other
exactly. Yeah.
people. That's why I
Yeah.
kind of lean towards that, actually,
Yeah.
without going into what I've heard the specs are. I will say, though, I think you know what? I'll say I think I can kind of answer the question about which way they're going for everyone listening. DLSS is core to its function in terms of how it's going to get the graphics it wants. I don't think that's going to surprise anyone. I think we've heard for a while that I'm not the first person to suggest the next Switch will make DLSS a major feature, which I think is good for Nvidia too.
Yeah.
Nvidia is then forcing all devs to support DLSS, and so
Yeah.
it's going to be supported moving forward. I don't hear it's very good at ray tracing, so I think that answers your question about which one it's on. I'll just say that now, everyone listening. So it's not going to do a lot of ray tracing, but it has DLSS, and I think that tells us right out of the gate it's probably the 10-watt 1024 CUDA core, probably cut down Orin. Um, would you agree 8 gigabytes is just not enough though? Like if they do 8 gigabytes like that, like I think they should go for 12. I think that's the sweet spot.
Well, how many gigs of RAM does the Switch have? Is it two?
It's like 3.
Oh,
Yeah,
three. Yeah. So was that enough in 2017?
not
The
really.
PS4 and the Xbox One had eight. So the Switch, yeah, 3 gigs. It's
Well, technically the PS5 the Xbox One X had 12 and the PS4 Pro had
yeah.
9 total. I
I
think
mean
it's unlikely they give it 16.
that that makes the Switch look even worse compared to those, though.
I know. I know.
Yeah, maybe if Nintendo wants more people to buy third-party games on the Switch too, because most people that I know that have Switches just buy Nintendo games on them.
Well, I mean, so what I would say is yeah, I don't know. Now you're actually almost kind of convincing me they would go with 8 gigabytes, to be
Yeah,
honest. But the only reason I actually would think they'd go with 16 is so they can just be confident saying what they have is better than the Steam Deck. But again, is that really something Nintendo cares about much? And if they force devs to use DLSS, that cuts down on RAM usage a little bit. And I think 1080p screen, don't you? Or do you think 900? Because I almost wonder.
I kind of doubt 1080p screen, to be honest.
Hmm. Like, it's not like it would do 1080p fantastically. I think we're looking at something that is likely to be a little stronger than the Steam Deck, but with less RAM and probably a weaker CPU, actually, or
Yeah,
similar. I mean, probably a weaker CPU because it's Zen 2 quad core. Um, that uses less energy though, yeah, but it uses DLSS. And if they give it a 9, it's probably like 900p really, really underclocked so that it has a decent battery life on the go. And then if you
yeah,
dock it, my guess is they just do like a 4K with like ultra performance mode turned on DLSS in each game
yeah,
so that it's really natively rendering at like 1080p and 4K or something.
yeah. I think that's likely enough. Just heavily leaning on DLSS upscaling to hit 4K is probably the direction they're going. And honestly, I think that's the main reason that Nintendo would even use DLSS or entertain the notion of DLSS. Because DLSS is fundamentally about getting more performance out of the hardware. Whereas Nintendo's like, you lost us on the word performance.
Hmm.
Like, they don't care. So why would they care about DLSS? But if it allows them to basically hit the 4K target on the TVs so that they can market that a lot easier, and then they don't actually have to worry about 4K development,
Hmm.
then I could see them doing that. That's probably why they would entertain DLSS at all to begin with.
And I bet Nvidia would be offering to be a very tight partner of theirs to help
Oh,
devs
yeah.
implement it because Nvidia wants devs to have DLSS in every game. This is the point, so that they don't lose this feature they have against FSR, which is for sure going to start pushing its advantage anytime it can as a major feature, especially if it does have some kind of like FSR accelerated mode in a PS5 Pro. You've seen Nvidia looking at that and going, no, 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 we need to make sure all games also support our stuff as
Yeah.
well. What do you think about the price then? So for to being honest, we're looking at something that in performance is like weaker than a PS4 Pro, but it has DLSS, so it can and a faster storage, so it can again. How do we put this right? Whatever the PS5 and Series X do in 4K, the Series S does in 1080p, kind of, or 1440p, and then this does in 900p, but it has DLSS. I've heard some people suggest $500, but I think that's too much.
If Nintendo charges $500 for a console, I will eat a shoe on video. Like
Yeah. I think 400 is probably the most they would go.
400 is pushing it for Nintendo because Nintendo wants to sell a bunch of these things, and that's a big selling point for the Switch. Is it's $350 depending on the base of the OLED. It's continued selling at that price for the life of the console. If they charge $500 for a Switch 2, they're basically forced to reduce the cost of the price of the console at some point to continue selling in large volume.
Yeah,
And
the
then
funny thing
if
is I've heard the form factors very, very, very similar, if not the same, by the way. So
I'm
I
kind of
think they may even
expecting
reuse
that
it.
too. I think like they're going to redesign it. It's going to look different. It's going to have new features. Like it's going to look distinct to the original Switch. Like you won't mistake it for it. But I think the form factor and the semi-portable, but also being able to be used as a home console is extremely successful for Nintendo, and I don't see them giving up on that right away. So yeah, no, having the same form factor makes a ton of sense to me, just because of how successful the Switch was, and it basically gives them a good reason to argue that they don't have to compete with PlayStation and Xbox in specs because they're targeting a completely different kind of thing, and it really helps set them apart quite firmly. So yeah, the form factor, that's good. The price needs to stay low though. $300 is probably what they would go for. No higher than $400 in my opinion. Maybe 350, but I think they'd be trying to hit that $300 price point.
I'm looking around too at the Nintendo Switch OLED right now, and I'm kind of thinking, do you think there's a chance the Switch 2 literally uses the same dock?
I think they would update it. Yeah, it's hard to
Because
say.
I can see the selling point though. If they nail the performance exactly where it needs to be, which is to say, hey, we skimped, we're Nintendo, but we didn't skimp it as much as before. It is just good enough that it should run all AAA games easily. And if it's 350, they're like, hey, look, the graphics aren't as good as the PS5, but it's 350 and it's a portable Series S kind of, isn't it? And you could just sell it for the same price as a Series S. That is actually a pretty appealing selling point there. And again, no, it's not 4K 120, but it's like ultra DLSS mode 4K 60-ish. Is that not good
Yeah,
enough on your big screen TV?
yeah. I mean, yeah. Again, Nintendo doesn't need to be the best. They just need something new that they can sell to people, and they'll buy it if their games are good. Which I think that's all they need to do.
All right, so we went through the PlayStation and the Xbox. I don't know that I have much to say about the Xbox because I think they just have more flexibility. The only thing I'd
They have,
add
yeah,
about talking about an Xbox refresh is, from my understanding, their primary focus is the Series S refresh, that they want to beef that up slightly and make it more appealing because they've noticed like they want to get Game Pass in everyone's house. That's their main goal, anyways. Like if we're like, and so if that means they can make a smaller die that is a little less weak, then they'll probably go for that. Is kind of what I'm hearing. But or did you have something to say about that before I moved on?
well, I was thinking what they could do with the die shrink, they could actually bring, maybe not this year, but like, in 1 or 2 years, they could actually do an Xbox Series X that replaces the Xbox Series S.
Mm.
So with a die shrink, with they could make an affordable. I mean, this happens every generation, right? Like,
Hmm.
or every console generation. Look at the Xbox One S. It was just an Xbox One, which is equivalent to the Series X right now. It was that, but it was a lot. They made it a lot more affordable. It was easier to cool. Um, it was smaller. Like, I would say, if someone said that that's not going to happen with the Xbox Series X, I'd tell them that they're high on glue.
Well, what I've heard actually, and the thing is, this was the plan, and it may have changed by now, but the plan about 6 months ago, or maybe even eight, I think at this point, 10 months ago, was by the end of 2022. So remember, this was late 2021, and a little over a year, they wanted to get out a 6 nanometer Series S that really just used a little faster RAM, maybe a little more RAM, and clocked faster because it's quite underclocked right now. And all they wanted to do is bump it up like 40% while keeping the same price, and then just keep selling a Series S that
Interesting.
they have now at a lower price. Like I
Right.
actually heard they wanted to get the existing specs down to like 250 to clear stock on them, and then have like a $300 version that was 30-40% better, which I think is, if you give it a little more RAM and make it 30% better, that's all it needs. It really doesn't need to be a 4K console. I think we've seen that people are
The
a little
Series S will
malleable
never
on that.
be a 4K console, but and it doesn't have to be. But the Series S, you can actually see it occasionally on sale already for 250. It wouldn't surprise me if it hit 200 even.
Hmm.
Um,
I think that's the sweet spot where it is like a fire sale thing they can't keep in stock if they get a 200 or lower.
yeah. And if I were Xbox, I might update the specs of the Series S a little bit, but I wouldn't want to have too many different performance targets for developers to like. It's a lot easier for Xbox developers on Xbox to target different levels of hardware because of DirectX. However,
Hmm.
they still have to validate it a lot more than they do on PC for those consoles because there's a lot of people with that set of hardware. So they can't say it's like, oh well, like someone on PC, it's like it's not running on you because you have a weird configuration. That's kind of on you. Whereas on console, they expect everyone who buys a console, it's like this packaged thing. They expect to have a playable game on that. And if they hit too many different hardware points, then that's just more validation that every dev has to do on every Xbox game, which could be a
Hmm.
barrier, honestly, in the decision to releasing a game on Xbox. And they're not going to want that either.
Yeah.
So,
That's why I don't think they go ham. I think they're just like,
yeah,
hey, and I think it's important for people to remember that TSMC is literally pushing these companies to move to 6 nanometers. So if you don't think they're planning at least a slim on
yeah,
six
no,
nanometer, they have to kind of.
yeah.
TSMC is like, it's cheaper, do it.
Slim versions of all of these consoles guaranteed. Absolutely. The question is, do they take the opportunity to bump the specs? The thing with the Xbox One S is its RAM is awful. Not
Hmm.
only is it only 10 gigabytes, but it's also so slow. But the thing is,
And it's segmented. If it was a unified 160-bit, that would be nice, but it's not.
yeah, it's 8 plus 2 on the Series S and 10 plus 6 on the Series
Hmm.
X. But the thing is, they can't correct that mistake. They can't release a Series S that's faster and be like, devs, forget about the first one, just target this one now. They still have to target that awful memory of the original Series S because millions of people have them. And they'd be super pissed off if those millions of people that bought those Series S's, suddenly it's like, oh, there's new games coming out that like major features on those games aren't supported on these old consoles. That would be devastating for Xbox's otherwise this generation very positive mind
Mhm.
share. Like Xbox is doing really well with their marketing right now, and they wouldn't want that blow, and that would just be awful. So yeah, they might create another bump it up and sort of create another tier there. I could see that happening. Maybe I think it's more likely that we see the Xbox Series X, the slim version of that, sort of replace the Series S where the Series S is right now, and then see the Series S come down to maybe $200, and then Xbox has this $200 console that anyone who wants gaming is just it's the most accessible way to get into gaming because it's so inexpensive, right?
Comes
Another
with
thing,
6 months of Game Pass or something silly.
yeah, like who knows? There's Xbox could do crazy things with that, and it would be wildly successful. Another thing that I think, in terms of hardware, that Xbox could too, and some people might think this is crazy, but the Steam Deck is wildly successful. The Switch is wildly successful. This is proving that people want
Mhm.
handhelds. So Nintendo it would be difficult for Nintendo to make a handheld. They could do it, but it would require like very different hardware, and for the
It'd be
developers to
difficult
do
for PlayStation to make a Nintendo or who
so
to
it
make a
would be
handheld?
difficult for PlayStation to make a
Mhm.
handheld because they would have to be separate games that run. This is sort of like the PSP, PS Vita.
I
You
brought
know,
this up on the last loose ends. I said, in my mind, the only world where this makes sense is if they find a way to basically make a portable APU that's backwards compatible with at least base PS4, so
yeah,
that you at least have that catalog carrying over to the handheld PlayStation.
right.
Because otherwise, I think Nintendo's proven something that I think we all knew deep down, which is that it was stupid that Sony was paying Ben to make Golden Abyss for Vita when they could have made a full Uncharted game for PS4 and sold way, way, way more copies. So my mind is, and I don't think this is implausible if Sony wanted to do it. My feeling is they don't want to do it, but I don't think this is an implausible idea that they just make an APU that's like a half PS5 that is backwards compatible with base PS4, but doesn't support the PS4 Pro mode necessarily. And then could you put PS5 games on it in 1080p instead of 4K? Yes, but it's going to take more than a little work. So they would have to it'd be a thing where it's up to the dev if they want to put in the effort. But let's be honest, it'd be way, way, way easier than developing for an entirely different ARM console.
That would you're right. It would be way easier, and they could go that route, and it would be a lot better than just make a console and it runs nothing unless the game is made for that console, like they did with the PSP and the Vita. So yeah, the PlayStation has something that they could do to make a handheld, and yeah, there's options. I actually do like your idea there
A half
of
PS5
a
backwards
half
compatibility
PS5,
to
and
base PS4, not base PS4 Pro or
right,
whatever.
yeah, I agree with that. And then so it doesn't run PS5 games.
It can run PS5 games. It uses the same SDK, dev tools, but the devs have to, yes, put in like half a year's worth of work to kind of like make sure it's not just collapsing, running at
Yeah,
half the
yeah.
compute units. But you could do it.
It wouldn't run PS5 games by default, but the devs
Mm-mm.
could port games to it from PS5 based on
It could literally be as simple as like you take the PS5 build and then you tweak some things and make sure it works and then validate it. Like,
depending on what CPU is on it, though. To be fair,
mhm.
as well, depending on
Probably the
its
same one clocked lower.
yeah, depending on its storage, you, it could be done. And you could make it relatively easy to port those games over, but it would still, it would require the developer to make the decision to port it over.
It's funny though to dork out about this though, because if I do AMD Rembrandt has 32 ROPs. People don't a lot of the recent AMD APUs have an overkill ROPs to make up for less bandwidth. So it's
Right.
entirely conceivable that what it would be in handheld form would be some 256-bit LP DDR5 64 ROP, but half the compute units for PS4. Because that's the only way I think you could easily do both PS4 emulation and that. 'Cause you're not going to give it
Right.
36
Yeah, yeah,
compute units. That's way
no,
too many. But you
yeah.
might actually keep the same amount of ROPs as the PS5, which Sony's shown a history of throwing ROPs at the problem before. So I'm just putting the hypotheticals out there for how silly the system. It may literally be like half PS4, half PS5, and it's
That
like
would be interesting.
it'd be an interesting console, but if in
Yeah.
my mind, that's the only PlayStation Portable that makes any sense anymore, unless it's like a PlayStation phone, because you're not developing for two different systems. That's just a waste of money.
Yep, I agree entirely. However, Xbox has a very straightforward solution to this. Xbox already has the Series S, which is a cut down, low cost, very, very small design that, I mean, what's the Xbox Series S right now? 75 watts? You need
It
like,
might be 50 watts. It's very low, yeah, and it's like an inefficient 75. Like it probably could have done more to make it more efficient.
so give it a die shrink, underclock it a little bit more. Um, Hell, I think you could absolutely make an Xbox mobile console that runs all of the same games that the Series X
Hmm.
does. Um, and it would be probably wildly successful because, you know, the Steam Deck and the Switch have proven that people like and mobile consoles. So they could get, Game Pass, they could get everything that they like about the Xbox generation, this whole generation, just boom, portable. Every
They're all
single
there,
game,
yeah.
they're all there. Just
And I've
running.
heard this as a selling point for Steam games lately as well, as people see the Steam OS, Steam Deck ecosystem growing. There's new third-party handhelds coming out from a couple of companies that they're weaker typically. They'll use like a Vega 3 Raven Ridge 2 APU or Mendocino ones coming out, but they support Steam OS. So if you buy a game on Steam, your game runs on Steam OS devices as well. And this is becoming a selling point to buy games on Steam instead of just playing them on Game Pass, I've noticed. So there
Interesting.
is an argument for Microsoft to want to do this, to say, no, 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 you can get our portable gaming thing too and play Game Pass games. And you could also maybe see Sony go, oh, no, 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 you can play ours on there too. It would be, I will say, it would be kind of like an M. Night Shyamalan twist if in 4 years, all of a sudden there's like more portable gaming devices than we've ever wanted. I don't think
Right?
anyone could have predicted that would happen a few years ago, and it seemed like portable
No.
gaming was almost dead.
Yeah. Well, Nintendo single handedly resurrected portable gaming.
Mhm.
Um, Companies realized with its sales that's like people want this. And actually, before the Steam Deck, there was companies making, a lot of the companies that are making those Steam OS consoles now were making just Nintendo, or they were making Windows mobile consoles before that just weren't selling that well because they were over $1,000. But the Steam Deck sort of brought the competition, and people, those companies started, having to compete more, so those prices are coming down, and this mobile gaming is like kind of booming now. It's crazy.
Well, and you can also see this argument as well. I don't think Microsoft's interested in VR, but I don't know if you've seen a lot of my recent content has been talking to people about how Steam seems to be building the Steam OS as a Trojan horse for an x86 portable gaming VR device. Like, because a lot of that
Interesting.
work transfers. You make the Steam Deck's too weak, but Little Phoenix wouldn't be probably if they use foveated rendering to just have a little box you strap to the back of your Valve Decker device. And then you start to wonder, well, then can Sony sell a PlayStation Portable that you put in your pocket, plug a USB-C in, and have a self-contained VR device as well that's compatible with the PSVR 2. I think it's a little pie in the sky. I don't want anyone to like hear this and go, that's definitely
Yeah.
going to happen. But you can kind of see this bifurcation happening as well, where you see portable gaming starting to merge with the development of VR as well. Sony is a company that cares about VR as well, too.
Yeah.
I want to be clear, though, again, for all this stuff I've talked about, I zero whispers of any portable PlayStation. So don't expect it probably ever. But I think it's interesting to talk about what could be possible. All right. Well, I mean, honestly, we've been talking for I don't know what the final edit will come to. It'll probably be a little less, but we've been talking for almost 3 hours here. We've
Yeah.
gone through Lovelace, RDNA 3, Intel's products. I mean, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo. I mean, is there anything else you wanted to talk about before I close this out, though?
No, I think we've covered sort of the main topics. There was one that I kind of wanted to talk about, but that would be this whole other conversation. So I think we can
Well,
just
let me see if we can do a 1 minute version, unless you're 100% sure. What would it be?
so basically, I just wanted to rant about Linus's video on the Apple Silicon. The one bit, if I can get it under 1 minute, basically they attributed so much to ARM. They were like everything. There's a lot of
Hmm.
good things going on with Apple Silicon, but they're like, oh, but it's so much less, or it's so much more efficient. Well, that efficiency isn't because it's ARM; it's because it's on a better node, and it's because it uses a lot of application-specific integrated circuits (ASICs). So, like, a lot of the comparisons that they made were just not valid for comparing architectures, or saying that Apple's approach with using ARM, like x86, is going to die. They made so many wild claims in that video that was just not supported by the evidence that they provided, because a lot of the evidence that they provided is explained by so many other things. They just wildly ignored variables for the sake of pushing a narrative that isn't supported by reality, basically. And it was
Well,
just
I haven't
massive
watched the video,
information.
but what I would say is anyone you talk to at Apple or anyone who works with Apple, they don't call their architecture ARM, they call it Apple. And Apple sees it as its own offshoot that's going to evolve into its entire own thing.
Yeah,
And the only other thing I could say about the ARM versus x86 thing is I think x86 seems to be doing fine all of a sudden on
yeah,
efficiency. All we needed was Intel to have competition and people to
yeah.
get their act together. I think x86 isn't as behind ARM intrinsically as people think. That's all I can say without seeing the video.
And another thing that a big argument that Anthony in the Linus Tech Tips video makes is that x86 is so old and ARM is new, so x86 is full of compatibility crap because of old hardware, that it's an old software that it's got to be compatible with. But ARM doesn't have that. Except if you actually look, ARM is like half a decade newer and
Hmm.
also has all of the same compatibility crap in it that x86 is.
If you
So it's
wanted
like,
something brand new, you'd use RISC-V.
yeah, basically. But RISC-V has a lot of its own issues too. Like, um, RISC-V kind of suffers a bit from it's expensive and difficult to scale in performance relative to x86 and ARM. RISC-V has sort of a design by committee issue where it's like a bunch of different types of blocks crammed together, and they don't, the cohesion allowing for streamlined designs that scale well in performance isn't really that. You can scale it, it's just more difficult, more expensive to scale in performance. So that's why we
Hmm.
don't see any, well, there's other reasons, but that's one of the reasons why we don't see, crazy high performance RISC-V designs.
Well, and again, what I would just say is like, did Apple go with ARM because ARM is intrinsically 10 times better than x86? No, it's because they don't have an x86 license, one.
Exactly.
And number two, their best sellers are their iPads and iPhones. And so it would make sense to have a programming base that's based on your best sellers, not their laptops. That's the answer, and
Yeah.
that's why they went with ARM. And I still think a lot of these are. Can people just give Apple credit for making a good APU? Like, it's just always got to be, oh, it's
Yeah,
because of this. Oh, it's because of that. Here's what it is. It's a giant APU on the newest node that they managed to match competition, even though they haven't been doing this as
yeah.
long. That's impressive. It's not because they had a magic advantage. It makes sense why they perform the way they perform. They designed a decent chip.
But they're not magic. ARM isn't magic. There's reasons for these. And it's not just because, oh, x86 and the traditional desktop form factor is going to die. There's
Hmm.
other variables that explain those differences.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. That's something I
Yeah,
feel like I have to harp on every single Apple release. But
yeah,
all right, well, I think that just about does it for the episode. I think this went pretty well. We've covered a broad range of
yeah,
topics. I think this worked as the kind of bird's eye view. Let's just the lay of the land to look before. I'm pretty sure near the end of this month, it's going to be nothing but rumors and news dropping every week again.
yeah.
Thanks for coming on, and plug yourself again. Tell people where they can find you. I know you have a blog.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You can find best place to get a hold of me is on Twitter, Meyer Tech Rants. Also, I'm on Blogspot, so just blogspot.com/Meyer Tech Rants. I post there every once in a while, and yeah, that's about it. Hope to talk to you. I have a Discord too. There's a link to both my blog and my Discord or in my Twitter bio. So drop by my Twitter. Really, that's how to get a hold of me.
All right. And as always, I also would say what I say at the end of all of these: subscribe to Moore's Law is Dead, ring the bell button, tell your friends about us, subscribe to Broken Silicon, your podcast app of choice. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps. Speaking of Apple, that really helps us get people in who aren't just people who browse on YouTube.
Mhm.
Support us on Patreon if you have the extra money. That is really the the number one way to show support if you've got it. But otherwise, thanks everybody for listening. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord, full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, AV, Anthony Gruffa, Greg Pateki, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Brett Jones, Aaron Close, Little Journey, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, Ivan K., Brian Riggleman, Dr. Forbin, Sam Miller, Deke, Thomas Rupp, The Mechanical Philosopher, Terrence Harrod, SNES Chalmers, Tom Bailey, Greg T. Wanchuk, Andrew S., Frank Zielinski, Daniel D., MJB1, Eric Jackson, Justice Brennan, Sammy Good, Valko Malev, The Boss Haas, Nicholas Buckner, Spamtham G. Spamtham, Jonathan, Lord Starscream, General Drips, Blake, Franco Frederic, Matthew Lazier, Jensen Wang, Nathan Nathan Mose, Azuris, Gregory S. Ecker, Dominique Koch, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Nine Neighbors Nobody, Caillou Merkelly, Hard4Room.com, Original Ross, Slicky, Stefan, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Christopher A. Butler, GZ Ziggy, Sarcastro, Stephen Hart, Jason B, Meat and Pork, Stu, Tim Robb, Luis Correa, Ian Clifford, Jesse Jaskowiak, Travis Gooding, Holden Mobley, Nanyan, Chris Rich, Deepest Learners, Mads, Suzu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Chuck Glidden, Sammy Wallace, Greg, Trini, Patrick Rowe, Amiable Chief, Brett Summers, Danny Nugent, Stephen Dick, Tommy, Kunden, Brucha, Mark Mitchell, McDaffie, Delmaine Peterson, James Anderson, Y Tree, Mark Raidmaker, Seth Domings, 3DS Boy 08, Hal Booma, Norithio, Matthew Landavazo, Stefan, Colatic, Henry Shang, Jetson N, Brendan O'Connell, The Grid, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Jason Bowen, Noah Nukuela, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Jeremy Ferreira, Zabeat03, Desist, Thomas A. Teff, Klein Britannian, DNA Tech, 50C Desert, Axel Cisneros, Royce Meyer, Charles Russell, Reginos R.E., Morpheus, Teak Autumn, Jackson Miller, JSMMH, Sandy Greedo Saunderson, David Eastland, Cameron, Art Andre Jacques, Gaiman Since Reagan, Jeff Sandler, Eric Osborne, Loophole 35, Winstar, Joker, James I. Radner, Corey Leonard, Sammy Malas, John Shin, Justin Bustle, Kelfin, Austin Haggerty, Roger Davies, Zalima, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.